right. Not our guy. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Listen, what I'm interested in doing is trying to explain the story of evangelicalism so that we can try to get to the Heritage America question. That's kind of the path that I'm on is, okay, America is a place, but it also is an idea. And what is that idea? And the journey that I'm on is to try to investigate and prove that it is extremely evangelical at its heart. That America is evangelical, and if people are uncomfortable with that, at the very least, we need to say that evangelicalism has massively influenced American ideas and values. And so, if that's true, then what is evangelicalism? Well, it's some kind of it's reformed, I believe. And I think that got lost in what I'm calling the deformation of evangelicalism. And much of that deformation, which contributed to the bloatedness of Big Eva, takes place. I know it takes place some before the 20th century, but a lot of it takes place in the 20th century. And a lot of things happen in the 20th century, like the Holocaust. And interestingly enough, a lot of the conversations right now that continue to threaten the purity of evangelicalism are things like Christian nationalism and Heritage America conversations, which are not directly related to the Holocaust question, but often involve that conversation about whether or not the Holocaust actually occurred and whether or not this idea of the consensus post-war or the after the war is one that should really hold us together or that we should believe in. Maybe I'm botching the way that you would describe it, but that's how I see it, and I think therefore it's essential to spend some time talking about the historicity of the Holocaust and kind of get into it by introducing ourselves to this idea of Holocaust denial and let you speak to that however you want. And then work our way through some of the history, the worldview, some of the modern players and things like that. Does it make some sense?
Yeah, that's checking out. I get what you're saying for sure.
So what? And you were gonna say something.
Oh, I don't remember what I was gonna say before we started recording.
I'm sorry.
But no, you're good. What I was the general thing that I was thinking about is you mentioned that your audience being more probably pastors or at least having a lot of pastors in it. Wondering what is the relevance of a congregant who doesn't believe that the Holocaust occurred. Like, why does that matter? Why is that any more meaningful than having a congregant that has any other historical position or something
Right.
like that?
Yeah.
And there's different levels of kind of thinking about that. Because on one level, I want to give the devil his due and say, you know what, it actually on a purely like a very I'm trying to figure out how to word this so it's not as edgy on a non-autistic or on a very autistic basis, right? In a very autistic way.
Not
Um,
Baptistic,
no,
autistic.
no, no, autistic in a very autistic kind of way. Right, not thinking about the social ramifications or any kind of implications around that. Just having a belief about history really isn't particularly relevant to somebody's walk with Christ, with the exception of Scripture and most, I think, the highest point of that being the resurrection and Christ's life, right? However, we understand that different historical beliefs have implications regarding the moral life of a believer. So if you have somebody in your church, and this is an example I've used before, but if you have somebody in your church who um, denies that abortions are taking place in America, and you may say like, well, that's ridiculous. Well, maybe so. But if someone is vehemently denies that that's occurring, that says that this is a propaganda device that's been deployed to divide the country, and that they're not actually aborting children in the womb or whatever, right? Or maybe someone denies vehemently that Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist or something like that, right?
Yeah.
we can say, okay, well, that's totally irrelevant to your walk with Christ because it's a belief about either a historical event or some sort of ongoing factual reality. We could just be totally agnostic about that. That doesn't really matter.
Mhm.
But I think we all seem to recognize that on some level, beliefs about history have implications about a person's moral compass.
Right.
And we understand this in the political sphere, depending on how much time you've spent around far leftists and things like that, people that would be referred to as tankies or whatever, um, that that believe that the communist atrocities didn't take place. So they'll
Yeah.
make excuses for the Soviet Union, or claim that Pol Pot wasn't murderous, or claim the Great Leap Forward didn't happen, or at least that it wasn't horrendous, or something like that,
Mm.
right? And we all seem to kind of, or at least a large part of the population in churches, I think, understand when people espouse something like that, that there's something going on here beyond just a rational assessment of the situation. It's not just sort of a something that's not morally charged or spiritually charged in any way.
Right.
Um, and so I'm applying that same reasoning when it comes to people who would claim or believe that the Holocaust didn't occur. I think that there's something going on here with that individual that leads them to that conclusion. And I don't think it's based on purely a somber and objective assessment of the evidence. And I think this is pretty clear by the lack of folks who seem to hold this position without other ideologies that would lend themselves to coming to this conclusion, right? Like if you have a guy who says, I don't believe the Soviet atrocities happened. Like I don't think tons of Christians and folks were killed in Russia during Stalin's time and things like this. And that guy also wasn't a communist. If he was like, I also hate communism,
Right.
you may have the presumption. I think it'd be more reasonable. Hey, maybe this guy's just confused. But if that
Mhm.
guy's also like, hey, I'm a communist, I love communism, and then he says,
Yeah.
I don't believe that these things took place. Well, then you're likely dealing with sort of a deeper ideological disconnect, and whatever that ideology is that's really driving that person to ignore the substantive evidence that does exist. That is what really fundamentally matters. But you can tease that out by raising the bar for them on what they have to overcome in regard to being irrational in order to assert the fact that an event like that didn't occur.
Yeah.
And that's what I've done in my videos and with some of the stuff I posted online on my Twitter or my Substack. Is I'm trying to show that there is very good reason to believe that the Holocaust took place, and that the folks that are denying it, by and large, at least I haven't encountered anybody kind of outside of this realm online, are doing so based on ideological reasons. And
Mm.
if those ideologies are at root incompatible with Christianity, which I believe they are, that's a problem. And it's especially a problem if it's found its way into the church. And so just sort of dismissing it as being um, an objective agnostic assessment of a historical fact, I think is disingenuous. And I think most people who are honest kind of recognize that to be the case.
You just explained very, very well what I've said, that they say the Holocaust never happened. Let's make it happen.
Well, even if they aren't as direct as saying that,
I'm
that's
summarizing.
sometimes the
Yeah.
implication. Yeah, that's sometimes the implication because um, the arguments will oftentimes descend, and if you've ever interacted with these people, you'll know, and I know you have. Um, they will go that same direction where, well, it didn't occur, but here are all the reasons why it was justified regardless.
It's yeah. So I love what you're saying, and it reminds me. I don't know if you're Van Tillian or not. It doesn't matter. It reminds me of like things that Van Til would say about evidence, even for the existence of God, and studying things like science or whatever. That no one is morally neutral when they're interpreting the evidence. And so when you're talking about a godless ideology,
Right.
you're talking about this reality that uh the sense in which history does matter. It does matter, not just the events, but the shared worldview by the people who are making these claims. about the worldview of the people from that time as well, and at an ideological level, I think that's really, really interesting, because if you get that, that presupposition or those assumptions wrong at the start before you start to do historical investigations, you're already in trouble.
Right. And one of the things that I've heard, and this is, we may talk about this a little bit later with the whole idea of the post-war consensus. Maybe we get into that or not. But um, one of the concepts that I've heard thrown about in some of these self-professing Christian nationalist circles is that the goal is to stop moralizing the 20th century. Um, and from my perspective, uh, all of the history that I have ever learned, all of the history that I've ever been interested in, um, as a Christian, I feel like I am obligated to moralize. Like, I view the entire history of the human race, all of mankind, through a lens of a Christian moral framework, right? I see peoples that become successful or rise or fall based upon God's grace, and I think that that's divvied out to some extent by the righteousness of the people.
Hmm.
And so saying that, well, we need to not moralize World War II or something like this, I find that just very, very odd language to be hearing from a Christian, especially because there's sort of a presupposition there that also undermines our ability politically the other direction, if you were more inclined that way, where if you have that position, well, then a lot of the claims about some of the left-leaning immorality in the 20th century with communism and things like this, then you lose the ability to view that as really on a theological level too.
Hmm.
And you've seen this somewhat with this may be a little bit inside baseball, but you've seen this somewhat with figures like Nicolas Fuentes, um, who have sort of in a very bizarre way also talked about how people like Stalin are cool, right? He not maybe not in, not saying that they're good guys, but seems to have sort of a odd affection for Stalin, and I think that that all kind of fits within this framework of trying to remove a moral lens from viewing history. And I don't think that,
Yeah.
that's something that Christians ought to be really attracted to, but it seems like many folks today are, or at least some are.
Yeah, I have tons to say about that, but let's go ahead and start to get into some of the claims that they make, and then just start to talk about that history. And I'll let you, I've kind of divvied up the direction of the conversation, but I'll let you take the lead, and I'll interrupt you with a ton of questions. But where would you like to start? Um, I guess
Well, I can give you kind of I can give you the case for, or I'll give you the case against the Holocaust occurring, um,
before, I'm
and then I
sorry,
can.
I forgot. Before we do that, I
Okay.
want to know that, yes, before it, and then their case against. I wanted to know, how did you find out about Stone Choir podcast?
Oh, I think probably Twitter a couple, like maybe 2 or 3 years ago now.
Okay.
I had not encountered anyone in person or anything that had told me about the podcast, but
Yeah.
I started seeing a lot of their influence online,
Okay.
um, probably 2 or 3 years ago, I think.
Okay. And
But
then
I'll
you.
be honest, none of the I feel like most of the Stone Choir stuff, if not all the Stone Choir stuff that I have heard, is repackaged stuff that I've kind of been aware of and tracking for maybe around 10 years now.
So what has been your interest in tracking that for 10 years before the Stone Choir got on your radar?
Yeah, so I've had some interactions with people both in real life and online, all the way back maybe starting at around 2015, and then for a while there, who excuse me, who were pretty involved in dissident right wing politics in some different organizations and groups and things like this. And um, I back when a lot of the anti woke stuff was becoming much more prominent in the cultural sphere, like around Trump's first election, there was an underground of people who were much more racially identitarian, like white nationalist type guys. And I met some of these guys in person, some of these guys online, and kept up with them and had, you know, what amounts to probably hundreds of hours of interactions and arguments with some of these guys way back then.
Mhm.
And so, because of that, I felt when some of this started, I started to see some of these ideas and arguments from these guys had been giving, um, being repackaged and then sold inside the church, that was bothersome to me. Because I also knew that a lot of the guys that I had interacted with, that were giving me those arguments all the way back then, were either neo-pagans or some formulation of like Christian identity,
Mm.
or something like that. And so that was all my alarm bells started to go off, and that was when I made my Twitter account originally, Hitler Hated Christ, because I wanted to put some of the stuff that I had already looked into from years before about World War II into a format that was consumable online and that folks could see and use in some of these conversations, especially in the church as they were having them.
I wonder how common that is. That was true for me as well. That like the first time that I came across these ideas actually wasn't online exclusively. It was also in real life.
Right.
And but I will say that these ideas have festered because of places like 4chan and the internet, just in general.
Yeah, none of the guys that that I knew in real life were old school, white nationalist Ruby Ridge type dudes who got figured this stuff out or came to these conclusions on the basis of reading books. It was all of those guys were derivative of the internet, even back
Yeah,
then. Every single one of them.
it's interesting. Okay, so yeah, you want to go ahead and make a positive case for its occurrence, and then.
Well, I was going to do the other way around. I was going to give
Oh,
you
okay,
their perspective on it
okay,
not occurring,
okay, that's fine.
just because I think it'll be kind of
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
So, from their perspective, um, the Jews as a collective national racial identity that was apart from Germany, um, were deeply invested and involved in a conspiratorial plot to undermine the national sovereignty and well-being of Germany. And they were collectively operating in a way that was creating mass depravity in Weimar Germany after World War One. They were running the banks, and thus they were at fault in their mind for um, all of the economic strife that was experienced in that Weimar time period as well. And Germany took very reasonable steps to reduce the influence of Jews in the public sphere, the negative influence of Jews, and Jews reacted dramatically by further economically punishing Germany and getting their Western allies to treat Germany unfairly regarding Germany's honest attempts to move eastward and recapture land that they had lost in previous generations in mainland Europe. Okay. Then Germany, seeing these efforts of these Jews and other groups that would be kind of in along with that, but Jews really primarily,
Hmm.
um, when it comes to the hyper conspiratorial side of things, um, they view Jews as not succumbing to their attempts to reduce their influence, and so they steadily increased the amount of justified oppression of those groups and ultimately deported or put in labor camps somewhat for their own protection the Jewish population at that time. And then after the war, because the Jews were so upset that they were put into labor camps or deported rightfully from Germany and its territories, they concocted a grand multinational conspiracy in the historical community as well as academia broadly, to convince everyone that they had actually been mass murdered in this time period, whereas they were treated much more similarly to how we treated the Japanese in internment camps in World War II. So that's kind of like that's the broad belief of the folks that would claim that the Holocaust did not occur.
Okay.
Now, you can imagine that there's a lot of areas where that can be questioned.
Hmm.
And there's different levels of this, right? So, because that's their perspective, some of the most culturally relevant facts around the Holocaust are things like the use of gas chambers
Mhm.
for killing Jews. And so you will see folks online who question the uh, capability scientifically and logistically for the Germans to kill Jews at scale using gas. They will question the types of buildings that are claimed were used today for gassing, and there's even examples of some of the people that deny that the Holocaust occurred or did at the time, going and touring places like Auschwitz or these other concentration camps in the current day or back in the 80s or 90s, and seeing either reconstructions of rooms or rooms that were falsely labeled as gas chambers that actually were not gas chambers
Mhm.
because Poles got overzealous in their reconstructions or how they were setting up their tours at these facilities and things like this, and pointing to those things as evidence of the gassings never occurring. There's also some sleight of hand that goes on there rhetorically, where the idea is that if gassings could be somehow shown to have not occurred, or at least not occurred at Auschwitz, then the entire Holocaust is therefore something that can be dismissed or viewed as something that didn't happen. This is a little bit, odd for folks who know a little bit more about what the historical consensus is surrounding how the Holocaust happened, because there were quite a lot of people that were killed by just shooting or worked to death in these camps and were not killed by gas, or people that never reached camps because they were shot and
Yeah,
just sort of dumped
and
in
I
a
was
hole
gonna
or
mention
whatever.
that there must be a spectrum of views on these
Yes,
issues,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah,
Because there is it wasn't that many, but they
right.
died as prisoners of war, but it wasn't like they weren't gassed, and so there might be some
Right.
people that say, "No, it didn't occur at all," but others might say, "Well, yeah, but they were casualties of war like any." Anyway.
Exactly, right. Or it'll be, well, they put them all in camps, which in their mind, from their perspective, the treatment of putting all the Jews in camps was justified. And so when they died of typhus or some sort of disease that sweeps through the camps. And they'll point to documents that are, earlier than when a lot of the mass killings started to really happen in these camps at scale. And they will claim that based on these documents that talk about typhus outbreaks, that, well, then it must have swept through and killed all those folks, right? But we've got other documents, and I've got a ton of them I can share with you now if you want, just kind of about that. But we have documents about saying that Poles would have to die a natural death, contrary to the measures that were applied to the Jews as early as like 42, things like this, that sort of contradict that. But really, it comes down to primarily, it's much easier to come up with sort of wild, speculative, alternative explanations for what could have happened to all of these people than it is to show through rigorous examination of documentary evidence that there really isn't a better explanation than that they were killed, right? And there's also a lot of things to take into account surrounding even like Hitler's rhetoric at the time regarding the Jews. There's a very harrowing passage in Mein Kampf where Hitler is talking about how he's upset that in World War I he felt like the Jews were the reason that they lost World War I. And he states very plainly that if we had just instead of our guys on the front line being killed through poison gas in World War I, if we had just taken those few thousand Jewish traitors who caused us to lose World War I and gassed them instead, we wouldn't have ended up losing the war, basically. And so even down to the mechanism that was ultimately deployed to some extent to kill all the folks during the Holocaust, or the Jews and others during the Holocaust, you see that mechanism spoken about by Hitler all the way back in Mein Kampf, which is many, many years before that came to fruition in the camps.
What did the Stone Choir guys say about Mein Kampf?
I mean, best I can tell, it's just really not addressed a lot. I mean, there are passages in Mein Kampf that are often taken I don't know if I don't recall if Stone Choir's done this specifically, but some people take various passages and try to claim that because he talks about a very sort of generic deistic God idea that he was a Christian or something like that. But there's quite a few sections in Mein Kampf that reveal not just Hitler's fierce animosity toward Jews that I believe were raised to the level of murderous animosity, um, but also his desire for world domination. There's a really specific passage that we can look at if you'd like that
Yeah,
talks about
I'd
that as
like to look
well.
at that. But
Yeah, let me
I
see.
bring that up
Yeah.
because he's supposed to be the Christian prince, and Corey Mahler
Right,
says he was the last Christian prince,
right,
and it doesn't seem like Nick Fuentes would say something like that. He thinks that he's cool, like Darth Vader is cool, or like Thanos
right,
is cool. But no, guys like Mahler, and again, this is spectrum, like we said.
right.
He's going all out and saying he was the last Christian prince. He was the ideal. Well, I would suspect that if I go to read Mein Kampf, I'd find some very devotional.
Right,
you
you'd
know,
find a lot more. It would read a lot more like a 1-year Bible plan than it would what you get out of it.
or
Yeah,
even
no,
even
definitely.
something like Thomas Aquinas and Just War Theory. Like you might find some militant language, but it would be more about Jesus to some degree, and not
Yeah.
if only we had guessed those Jewish traitors.
Exactly. Exactly
I'm
right.
just
Yeah. Let me
saying.
see. So the section that I was referencing here, I got it pulled up here. This is page 216 of the Inexpurged edition. There's a bunch of editions of Mein Kampf, but this one is generally accepted, and we can talk about that later if you want to go in detail. But um, on this planet of ours, human culture and civilization are indissolubly bound up with the presence of the Aryan. If he should be exterminated or subjugated, then the dark shroud of a new barbarian era would enfold the earth. To undermine the existence of human culture by exterminating its founders and custodians. He's talking specifically about Aryans here, by the way, in comparison to Slavs. So he's even that granular when it comes to this. He's not talking even just all whites. He's talking compared to Slavs. Um, would be an inexorable crime in the eyes of those who believe the folk idea lies at the basis of human existence. Whoever would dare to raise a profane hand against that highest image of God, again, talking about the Aryans as the highest imago Dei. So he seemed to think that that was a quantitative idea of like that Aryans were on top, that the most in the most image of God, and others were beneath them. Among his creatures would sin against the bountiful creator of this marvel and would collaborate in the expulsion from paradise. So he like likens the idea of Aryans being in his mind oppressed by the lower races, the ones that are not as much in the image of God, to like the fall in the Garden of Eden. So you can see how like if you read this and you're just theologically, you don't really know what's going on, but you see a lot of this sort of theological language, you can be like, oh yeah, well Hitler was a Christian because he said God here, right? But
Mm.
whatever he's waxing about here is not that. Hence the folk concept of the world in its profound accord with nature's will. So you've got some pseudo Thomistic stuff here going on. Because it restores the free play of the forces, which will lead the race through stages of sustained reciprocal education towards a higher type. So elevating the Aryan until finally the best portion of mankind, the best of the Aryans, will possess the earth and will be free to work in every domain all over the world and even reach spheres that lie outside the earth. So he has
There
this
it is.
yeah, so this idea of not just taking over the planet, but like all of, I guess, the universe or every other planet too. And so it's this utopian vision of Aryan dominance, and that the only way that can happen is through the Aryans being the guys on top of everything. We all feel that in the distant future, many may be faced with problems that can be solved only by a superior race of human beings, a race destined to become master of all the other peoples, and which will have at its disposal the means and resources of the whole world. So that's the 216 in Mein Kampf Inexpurged edition. So you can pull that up, and I'll send you that afterwards too, so you can throw it in the video.
So that sounds very eschatological, very
Yes.
theological.
Yep.
And my first, by the way, my first thought is not that it's therefore Christian. I'm trying to figure out
What is it, right?
yeah, what is that? Like what so one of my first thoughts, because that's where these conversations started for me, like a over a decade ago, was about theonomy and postmillennialism.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like it reminds me of a kind of dominionism. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to figure out how that works with
Well,
National Socialism. Go ahead.
the difference I think would be, I mean, he's framing it from the perspective of the Aryans having this sort of supreme ultimate eschatological dominion, as opposed to Christians more broadly in more of a dominionist view. But you're right in that it's utopian. Um, and there
But
is this
but
idea.
for what though? I'm sorry to cut you off, but like, what
There you go.
is the purpose of this project? If it's not, it's theological in some sense, but it's not a Christian theology. And so why, like, actually, I would like for you to go back and try to explain this God that he's referring to. What do you think that he's referring to, and what is informing him
Yeah, good
when he
question.
says that?
So Hitler, in my opinion, and Dr. Richard Weikart, who's a great resource on these things, he's an academic historian that I've used a lot of his work. Um, he and I share the opinion that Hitler was a panentheist, which is similar to a pantheist, but it's somebody that believes that like God is one with nature, that nature itself may not be God, but God and nature are sort of one and the same, and they move between each other. You
Hmm.
can look up panentheism, just Google it if you want kind of a brief and probably better explanation than I gave there. But really, so this means that when he talks about nature's will, he's talking about his like sort of idea of God in that way. And because it's tied up so closely to the natural world, to the material world,
Mm-hmm.
um, he ties in things like evolution to it. So the survival of the fittest, that is like one of the purest expressions of nature's will. And we even see this in some um, Nazi like propaganda at the time. Like there's this one from I think 38 that's like a school poster. I can also send you this too if you want.
Okay.
Um, it's an image of a hawk that killed a rabbit and a guy cutting down a tree that was wasting away. And it says, elimination of the sick and the weak in nature. Whatever cannot stand the demands of existence is destroyed. Eradication of the sick and weak in nature does not, or of what does not meet the demands of existence. Yeah. So, the idea is that nature itself, nature's will, creating better and better um, entities, um, is the same thing as God's will. Like that's one and the same thing. And so he views the Aryans as being superior. And so he thinks that all of the weakness in the world, all the other races that are allowed to continue living as they've been living, is suboptimal in that it would be better if the best of the best were the ones that were in charge and elevating humanity. And this gets into all the eugenic behavior that they deployed also, with being adamant about sterilizing people with any sort of disease that they view as hereditary, or things like this. Also being pro-abortion in some scenarios.
So what convinced you? Do you remember? That's a great job explaining that. By the way, what are the other competing views for Hitler's reference there to this divine being, and why does panentheism? Why are you and Dr. Weikart convinced of panentheism? That was what he was
Um,
referencing.
well, just the amount of times that Hitler references it, references nature as
Mhm.
being interchangeable with with aspects of God's character. Um,
Mhm.
so like he talks about the will of all highest and omnipotent nature. So he uses like that kind of terminology
Hmm.
to talk about these things. Borman does the same thing. Um, so he uses theological terms in reference to nature itself, and by extension also talks about the will of the Volk, like the will of the people of Germany, as being a sort of refined but also an extension of nature itself. And so when you read this and you see him reference God and nature and their qualities so interchangeably, it becomes pretty clear to me. When it comes to competing perspectives on this, it's really tricky because um, there are not a lot of historians that have the theological um, I guess chops, and I'm not saying that necessarily I do because I'm not a trained theologian, um, but there aren't a lot of historians that also have really any theological background to be able to
Hmm.
assess these things. So you get books by guys that are ironically oftentimes Jewish guys who write books on this topic because they for pretty obvious reasons of historical incidents are pretty interested in World War II and Nazi Germany
Yeah.
and they will claim that Hitler was a Christian. And then when you actually read their books, you will come to find out that they concede all of these things that I make claims about. Where that Hitler was a Christian, but he also believed that nature and God were one, right, or something like that. Or they'll say that Hitler denied that Paul, like that he denied the New Testament as being fully inspired. Like he rejected the teachings of
Yeah.
Paul, but Hitler was a Christian. Right, things like that don't really comport, but because they're reading this as a historian without theological understanding, those are the sorts of conclusions they come to.
Yeah. So,
So,
on that note, this is why we're doing what we're doing, because I didn't know enough to be able to say how you just said it, but after this part of the conversation, I'm realizing that that is, it's really unfortunate because the Holocaust and just World War II, Nazi Germany in general, is such a cultural, I say icon, but I mean it's a symbol, it's a thing, that we want to stay away from that, never forget, and it's all the way down to the stormtroopers in Star Wars. I
mhm,
mean, the way Lion King is another, like these images we have of the Gestapo and how they were,
right.
and yet I wonder if it's one of those things that has gone under the radar because it seems to be so assumed. I know this is true for me in a lot of cases. Like, I actually don't know as much about World War II as I wish that I did. And now that these
Uh-huh.
conversations are getting increasingly, and that I don't know your whole story, but that may have been the case when you're talking to other people like that, and it's like, wait, say what? And that was true for
Right.
me. Where like,
Right.
I guess I need to brush up on some history. And anyway, I think that leaves like kind of a vacuum. Like we need more work done on here on this issue. Actually, not less. It's not. Oh, there's too much World War II propaganda. We got to get away from that. Get away from the post-war consensus. No, actually, we need more
Right.
thoughtful theological engagement on this topic. And
There's too much secular content about World War II and not enough theologically informed content. That's what I
absolutely.
think. Because I do
And
think um a sort of naive perspective on World War II that the lesson to learn from World War II is that um any amount of national pride or cohesion is evil or something like that, and that's
Mhm.
that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I will say that I think that those conclusions are largely exaggerated insofar as I
Hmm.
think people think about them.
Yeah.
I think people really don't think a lot about kind of the reasons and motivations behind Nazi Germany a lot of times, to be honest with you.
And I've heard, I could just rattle off like a handful of scholars that I heard this from, like it just in class and stuff, say over the course of a couple of years, they would refer to the 20th century and World War II and the Holocaust as quote unquote traumatic. It was traumatizing for the West and for the world, and especially, even I would say even in America. Like this has been something that's just like how trauma, I mean, whatever you think of trauma or trauma studies, like trauma,
Mm-hmm.
it means wound in the Greek. It's a real word in the Bible referring to the Good Samaritan in the Good Samaritan story. Trauma is a thing, um, and just simply as data. And I'm not talking about trauma psychology studies, or I'm just talking about as data. Like something horrible has happened, and
Right.
our social imaginary has had a very difficult time, including, and I might would even say, and especially the evangelical community, wrapping their heads around it. And I
Yeah.
suspect that Karl Barth was one of the first evangelical scholars reacting to that, and opened up a way of thinking about God, in fact, shaped by his experience in the war, that was actually, um, I'm quoting a Barth scholar here. I'm not going to say his name because we haven't scheduled him yet, but he's coming on. I'm super excited about this. But he said something that had never been seen in like Christian theology that had never been seen before on the face of the planet. And
Yeah.
that's
Right.
opens up the door for, like, actually, I think a lot of continued liberalization of evangelical theology. So just another little feather in the hat there to say we need some really solid reformed evangelical thought on this. Bart doesn't cut it. But
Yeah.
he tried to react to this, but not much more helpful than other Jewish thinkers that are trying to interpret these realities.
Exactly. Exactly. And one of the things that's interesting, what you said there is perfectly um, accurate around the traumatic component of this. People hear that and they kind of, I think they hear it through almost like a modern pop
Yeah,
psych way, and so they think, like when I hear that, oftentimes my mind goes to the idea of
right.
intergenerational trauma from
Yeah,
slavery or
yeah,
something like this. And I think that although whoever can do work on that if they want to and try to prove whatever, there is something to be said about the fact, because I had somebody ask me the other day, why what is Germany viewed so much more harshly or intensely evil than Japan is viewed on because of World War II?
right.
And I was like, that's a great question. I think that Japan is oftentimes it is more talked about now, I think, than it was historically in the
Yeah,
depravity. Like if you look up World War II torture or something, you're going to get a lot of Japanese related stuff that was
yeah,
pretty horrific on YouTube. But there is something to be said about the fact that Germany was the land of the Reformation. These
right.
are these are these are our they were the ancestral brethren in the fatherland
Yeah,
for a huge portion of the American population.
yeah.
Um, and so when something like this happens, it's not so much that I think people viewed the Germans as traitors, but
Hmm.
when it subverts what our expectations and our standards are for a Christian people, it's
Hmm.
far more impactful.
Yeah,
And I think that was felt very real in a very genuine way. And I mean, I have my family's German background, and I won't go to a lot of detail on that. I think we may have talked about that before a little bit, but um, I have heard stories of very distant relatives through my mom, who after World War II were in some sense Holocaust deniers, and I don't know to what extent that was. This is long before I was born, obviously, and before my mom was even born. But the idea was that there were people in the family who were first generation immigrants from Germany who just could not believe that that the German people had done something like that.
hmm,
And within a generation, I think that was sort of, it just kind of like that denial disappeared because it was so clear to everyone, not just that it happened, but the motives behind that person's reaction were based upon
yeah,
the sort of traumatic impact that you're talking about.
yeah,
And so for those sort of people, I think that um, there's obviously grace for everyone, deceived
yeah,
or not. Um, but that is something to consider, and there may be people that feel that more today than maybe I do, even though I have a very German background. Um, who do maybe feel that in a sense, and
Yeah.
some of that has stuck around in Germany itself.
Yeah.
I was actually in Germany when they won the World Cup for the first time after many years. I have to look up what year this was, but when I was a kid, and there were people in the streets waving German flags, the young people. And the old people were very concerned by
Mm,
this. They were very bothered by this because, from their perspective, that level of national pride and bravado, or whatever, was to be frowned upon.
yeah.
And there were elderly people that would say, "I've never seen Germany like this before. This is the first time I've ever seen anybody like with German flags, like waving them
Yeah.
outside on the street and that kind of thing." So there's an aspect to that. Now, how much of that is um, on the basis of, because there's some groups would say that was instilled in the German people on purpose because of communist hate for white people or something, um, or leftist political machinations.
Right.
But I think there's something to be said about the theological point about that these were a people that were the birth, where Protestantism was birthed,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to see it descend into
Well,
that degree of depravity is very shocking and traumatic.
I just and I take that as an ironic providence, and I mean a fascinating part of God's story. You know, bringing about the Reformation through a man like Luther, and then to see that country have such a blight on it, it's hard to not just smell the devil. You know, walking around doing his
Yeah.
thing. Um, and actually, speaking of, I want to get to Luther if you have anything to say on that. But right now, I just want to acknowledge we're talking a lot about worldview,
Yeah.
and you know, I think that's one of my points is that that's really hard to do, or I'm sorry, that's really hard to not do when you're talking about the history, because we are. I mean, you're sitting here quoting historical documents, but you're quoting a man's beliefs, and we're talking about panentheism and um, what were we just talking about? Now we're talking about evangelical interpretations or lack thereof of this. And so, do you want to get more into the historical denials, or the questions about the history, or do you want to dive more into the worldview side of it? Because you still have to make your case for what happened. What?
Yeah, let me just kind of zoom through that real quick.
Okay.
So I have a 3-hour video, which if you want a link, that would be great, where I mention a lot of these documents, and I go through Stone Choir's podcast that they have put out years ago. That's 3 hours long, and I point by point handle pretty much every claim in that video.
Can I say something on that note? Because I'll say this in my Brave New Tube video, but I'm upset
Yeah,
at
go ahead.
myself. I haven't already said. Everybody has to go watch it. The only reason I haven't finished it, I've gotten an hour is into it, is because it's that chock full of details. It is very, very good, very like to the point and cuts through the noise, just talking about the facts. And it's very good. I highly recommend that everybody go check that out. Please
Thanks.
continue.
Appreciate it. So the biggest thing I point to, and you'll see, in that whole video, is the documentary evidence that we do have from just things that we recovered after the war. So the Nazis did try to cover up a lot of this stuff. A lot of these camps, the gas chambers were leveled. They blew them up. And there was an order that went out to stop the mass executions when it became clear that the Allies were going to be coming through. The Soviets for a lot of the camps in the East, but there were also camps in the West where a lot of people were murdered that were liberated by the Allies. There's a lot of academic discussion around what camp is a concentration camp versus an extermination camp, that kind of thing. Ultimately, a lot of people were killed at all these camps, even if the intention of some of them was to kill people right off the bat, whereas the other ones might have just been for people who were capable of labor. There are a lot of documents that refer to a special action that's designed to be applied to Jews specifically.
Hmm.
So, for instance, here, this is I think I referenced earlier, but a document from 42 talks about imbeciles, idiots, and cripples and sick people have to be removed from the camp within a short time by liquidation, which is a euphemism they used quite a bit, to unburden the camp, which means whatever they were doing to liquidate them unburdened the camp of these people. Poles have to die a natural death, contrary to the measure applied to the Jews. And this is an SS document from 42, I think in December 42. Other examples of this are references to the amount of women and children that were applied a special treatment under a special action. What that means isn't really explained because it's a pretty obvious euphemism. And we have all sorts of transportation logs for who were sent to these camps in the East and then never were heard from again. The thing is that a lot of the deniers, well, pretty much every denier that is serious enough to get into any of these arguments, accepts the fact that millions of Jews were sent east, and that they were in these camps. What ultimately happened to these Jews is the question. And given the documentary evidence and the rhetoric and all of the eyewitness testimony, everything together, it's pretty clear that what occurred was that they were killed, because we don't have any record of millions of Jews appearing somewhere else in the world at this time. We don't have that in the population data from the Soviet Union. We don't have that it's not like they all went to Israel or something like this. That's just not the case. We've also got correspondence, this is in March of 42, between Wehrmacht soldiers talking about the measures that they saw being applied to the Jews. And this is an interesting one. I'll read this paragraph for you real quick. This is between two Wehrmacht soldiers in March of 42. And it really shows...
Say that again?
Sorry, two German army soldiers in March of 42, and it's called the Wehrmacht. This is not the SS. These are more just standard draftees in the military, not the SS. And they're writing letters back and forth. Last night we sat and talked about the things that make one ashamed to be German. What you hear here about how the chosen people are being treated. This has not, and he puts chosen people in parentheses, by the way. This has nothing to do with anti-Semitism anymore. It's inhumanity of a kind one should no longer believe possible in the 20th century, this quote-unquote enlightened modern era. How will we ever atone for this? Hearing such accounts, and here you get them firsthand, makes one despair at the meaning of our fight. But what else is left for us? Shut up and continue to serve. So you have documents like this, and it's like, okay, well, what's going on here? Like, I can't think of an interpretation of this that does not include, that is not just obviously two German soldiers that are largely influenced to believe that anti-Semitism is a positive thing, who are recognizing in real time in 42 that the treatment of the Jews in the East is depraved, that they're just being murdered, right? And the way that they reference it is it's just obvious. There are other documents specifically around Auschwitz that talk about the special action, like I mentioned earlier, and reference cremation capacity and bathing installations. So that's odd. Special action has to mean something regarding cremation, so people are dying, and bathing installations, which we have eyewitnesses of people that have talked about how Jews were told that they were going to get showers or whatnot, and then led into the gas chambers to be killed. And so you have documents like this that talk about the massive cremation capacity of Auschwitz of being like 4,700 plus people able to be cremated daily at a camp complex like Auschwitz-Birkenau. Wow. So what does that mean, right? What is the special action? These are all things that deniers have to deal with. And there are some that do their best, and they will say that they'll claim something like they were deloused, like that they were the special action just refers to, or the special treatment just refers to killing all of the lice on the prisoners or something like that. But then there's other document. Killing all of the lice that were on prisoners that were brought into the camps. Sorry, yeah. That's one of
Even,
the sort
yeah.
of denier claims, yeah, is that the special action wasn't killing them, even though the context in some of these other ones seems to indicate that. It actually meant that they were just bringing these people into work camps and they had to clean them from lice, and so they gave them all baths and stuff, right? But then there's other documentary evidence. This is a guy, an SS doctor, also 42. It's funny how many of these are 42. In August of 42, who records in his diary how he attended a delousing of a block of cells, a block of quarters for people to live in Auschwitz,
Hmm.
and he references how he attended on September 1st, how they used Zyklon B to delouse a cell block or a living quarter block, and then later on September 5th, in using entirely different language in the same diary on the same page, um, he says, in the morning, attended a special action from the women's concentration camp. The most dreadful of horrors. All right. The master sergeant was right when he said to me that this is, and he uses Latin here for the anus of the world. In the evening toward 8, attended another special action. Because of the special action, the soldiers receive extra rations and more cigarettes, right? So it seems to be that, like, when he's talking about delousing, he's just writing very, I attended a situation where they deloused, they used Zyklon B to kill a bunch of lice in a facility. And then on the 5th, 4 days later, he attends something different called a special action that was at a women's concentration camp that he considered a dreadful horror, and apparently was so traumatic it required that soldiers receive more rations and that kind of thing. Similar to how when, like, soldiers joke today about how, like, before they go to war they get a really good meal, like they get served lobster or something. Same sort of deal, where it was like the generals recognized that the morale was low because they just had to kill a bunch of people. So there's all kinds of idiosyncratic things like this. There's one of the things that you find in these claims is that the Jews were deported to the east again. They don't really know where, but just somewhere else. And you also have people who are on the political left today talk about how the like the operations that ICE is doing today with mass deportations and things like that are akin to what the Nazis did, right? But there's other evidence that kind of blows a hole in that perspective from both sides. We have a German police document here from 44. I think I also referenced this in my video, which is discussing how Jews are not allowed to leave the country. So it's like, in view of the special final solution to the European Jewish problem, there is still a ban on e-migration. So Jews are not allowed to leave as of April 44. Apart from this, so separately from this, it's been determined that they can't leave because they're going to be an increased threat abroad. But that really contradicts both those perspectives from the right wing, from the real authoritarian side on the right. People saying that this didn't happen would say, well, they were just deported. Well, no, they weren't legally even allowed to leave. So it sounds like they weren't deported. And then people claiming that ICE operations today are akin to Nazi procedure are also in the wrong, because again, they weren't allowed to leave. They had to keep them in the camps for a reason, and it was, as we know from Goebbels and others, to use the ones that were fit to work as slave labor, and the ones that were not fit to work they killed. And that also aligns perfectly with their perspective on eugenics, and their theological belief of the fittest being the ones worthy of continuing to live, right? So there's a really clear passage in Goebbels' diary where he records in February and March, also 42. He says in the February passage, the Führer once again expressed his determination to clean up the Jews in Europe pitilessly. There must be no squeamish sentimentalism about it. The Jews have deserved the catastrophe that has now overtaken them. Their destruction will go hand in hand with the destruction of our enemies. We must hasten this process with cold ruthlessness. And this is in his private writings, which we recovered after the war. And there's a whole story on how we have these. It's actually really interesting. March of that same year, the procedure, referring to the procedure as referenced in February, but talks about a little bit before too, is a pretty barbaric one, and not to be described here in more detail. Not much will remain of the Jews. On the whole, it can be said that about 60% of them will have to be liquidated. So there's the euphemism again. Whereas only 40% can be used for forced labor. So
there you go.
Yeah.
So what do I vaguely remember Mahler mentioning Goebbels before, but I can't remember what he said. Like, what does he say about a passage like that?
So that's a great question. So first off, he doesn't confront it directly, and he doesn't, I think, because he has some sense. I've had a long-standing.
He used the word barbaric.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean,
oh yeah. I've got the stand.
You would have to start to say, well, all of these documents are fabricated.
Yes, you do, and that's essentially what Mahler has done.
Not pseudonymous. Am I saying that correctly? Like it's
Well, he claims that they are fabricated. He says that they're forgeries, and there's a bunch of reasons why we know that's not the case. But we can go into that if you'd like to. But he has claimed, and I've had a very long-standing offer or challenge, I guess, to Mahler to debate this topic.
Have you?
Yeah, oh yeah, for years now.
Wait a second, hold on. Why did he say yes to James White and not you?
Well, I think that this topic, as much as the other one, I think James White did actually a very good job.
Oh yeah.
This topic is so, I think, clear, and it requires so much intricate research that I don't think he's willing to do. Mahler, that is. That it's better for him to avoid it than it is to deal with it. Whereas the Mahler topic is much less based on like very hard historical evidence and materials. Like this I have this tweet, for instance, here that I put on my Substack because I talked recently about the Goebbels diary on the authenticity of it, and somebody added him and says, "Debate at not our guy, who's me, and we'll all be satisfied." And Mahler says, "Get him to admit that table talks are unreliable." That's one of my sources. That Goebbels' diaries are forgeries. That's, again, another one that I've used quite a bit. And that materials obtained under torture or serious threat are, like the table talks, unreliable and unusable, and then I may consider it. So he's referencing their claims about the procedures around the Nuremberg trial and the documents that were obtained at that time, which it's a little bit odd because, the Nuremberg documents that matter are not ones that would matter if they were obtained under torture, because they're contemporary documents for during the war. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense. But Stonequire also makes a lot of claims about prisoners being tortured to confess to things immediately following World War II. And the example that they actually use in the news article they reference in their 3-hour video about that topic, or their podcast about that topic, is not even about Nuremberg. If you look at the article and you read the U.S. investigations into those situations, the article is actually falsely claiming to be written by somebody who didn't write it, for one, and it also is not even about Nuremberg. It's about a completely different investigation that ultimately concluded that nobody was tortured. So there's all kinds of stuff like that they use, but his claim is that the Goebbels diaries entirely are forgeries, basically, and that he won't debate me unless I concede that to him. To which I say I would love to debate the authenticity of those sources, because if we debate the idea of any of these topics, we can talk about my sources and why they're authentic. I've got a bunch of reasons for that we can get into, but that may be a little more granular than you want to talk about. But
I would like.
I give you one good one.
Yeah.
Okay, so Goebbels records in 1943 the occurrence of the Katyn massacre, which is a event where the Bolsheviks, the Russians, mass executed a bunch of Poles, and they were later discovered. So like they were killed in the 40s, and then all the remains were killed, or excuse me, they were killed in around, and we believe April or May of 40, and then all of the bodies and graves were discovered in 43. The claim by the Soviet Union for the longest time was that the Nazis killed these people. And that was actually believed for a little while after the war, until it was ultimately concluded that it actually was the Bolsheviks that killed these Poles, right? And that's the consensus historically of pretty much everybody now in the West, is that the Bolsheviks did actually kill these guys, and they claimed that the Nazis did it, and the general consensus was wrong back like immediately following the war on that. Mahler claims that the Goebbels diary, which ultimately after the war, some actually versions of it, some microfiche plates that they were scanned into, were found in the Soviet archives. Mahler claims that the Soviets fabricated the Goebbels diaries. The problem with this is that in the entry, or for propaganda purposes, he claims they fabricated it for propaganda purposes. The problem with this is that we have an entry from Goebbels in 43 when they discovered the Katyn massacre, the graves. And Goebbels is clear that he believes in his own personal diary, again, not for propaganda purposes, he wrote this down himself in his diary, that the Bolsheviks did this. So if you were the Soviets and you were fabricating a diary of Joseph Goebbels to use for propaganda purposes, why would you do so in such a way that you contradict your own government's current propaganda about who committed this atrocity? It doesn't make any
Mm.
sense. Um,
Mm.
and there's all sorts of idiosyncrasies with the Goebbels diary that lend itself to us knowing that they're true. There's corroborations between um, uh, Goebbels' recordings of conversations and Rosenberg's personal diaries, where they record the same statements or very similar statements made by Hitler on the same day or one day apart, depending on when they wrote it in their diary. As well as women like Krista Schroeder, or a woman named Krista Schroeder, rather, who recorded some statements by Hitler that are recorded also by Goebbels and in the Table Talks records, which were ultimately created by Bormann. So there's all kinds of different reasons why these are considered authentic, and even revisionists, even David Irving, who's probably the biggest revisionist that people would know, uh, whether or not he denies the whole Holocaust occurred is a different question. But he's a prominent revisionist, and he got into some legal trouble over it in Europe, actually, 10, 20 years ago or whatever. He believes that the Goebbels diary is authentic. It seems to be the consensus of even revisionists that Goebbels'
Which
diary is
includes that
authentic.
statement about barbarism.
It does.
Hmm.
Yep. And it's actually kind of comedic how you get into some of this, because I have heard people claim that, yeah, well, the Goebbels diaries are obviously real, but the barbaric procedure he's talking about is merely deportation, and the liquidation is deportation. Which, again, imagining that Goebbels believes that deportation is barbaric in comparison to slave labor doesn't make any sense at all.
Dude, this is just one big cope.
No, that's exactly right. It's one
And
big cope.
it's kind of like you grow up before you want to admit that you were like mistreated, uh, exually, say for YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
uh, by your uncle, and you just keep coming up with reasons why it wasn't that bad. Or
Right.
I'm reminded of this Dane Cook joke. You're in a toxic relate. Do you know who Dane Cook is, or
No, I don't. Tell me.
I'm too old. Oh gosh. He's like, you need to leave this guy. He's abusing you, and you shouldn't be in that relationship anymore. And you're like, come up with all these reasons why you shouldn't leave. And your girlfriend's like, you got to leave. And you're like, I can't. You don't understand. My CDs are in his truck. I can't leave, and my CDs are in his truck. Anyway, it was a funny bit, but it just sounds like,
It's like that. Yeah, it doesn't make sense because it's not based on.
look, I get it. This
Yeah.
sucks. That's part of the history, but that is part of the history, and like you're just denying it. It's just like a cope. I- and and this is my question for you: Let me know if I should cut this out. Is Corey Mahler a Fed? I mean, this is bananas.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think they're true believers. I just think that they're gullible, and I think that they're motivated to be so. And
I think
when you
you're the
watch
leading
their,
guy on Stone Choir, so that comes with some authority that if
yeah,
you
I
don't
appreciate that.
that they are sincere,
Yeah,
you're
I think they're
sincerely
sincere.
wrong.
Yeah, I think they're sincere, and I think that they have been. It's one of those things where the whole idea of getting red pilled gets really weird.
Mhm.
So when you get red pilled, right, your eyes have been opened to the reality. It's kind of a Gnostic thing, but your eyes have been opened to the reality of this secret knowledge, right? And the problem is that you start to build things on top of that. So the first thing you might have been red pilled on is like women. You may,
Right.
somebody, you might have had some weird impression that women were basically sinless creatures, angel, beautiful angel. All of them were beautiful angels. And then somebody came along and was like, but they're not. And then that was your first red pilling. You're like, oh my gosh, right? And then from there you have, there's more things where like little hard truths that clarify, that you feel like clarify something in the world around you, that kind of like come your way, um and you accept them and you accept them and you're like, oh man, like this is really, things are starting to make sense now. I'm building a whole superstructure of these like little inconvenient, hard, edgy truths, right, around myself. And what happens is you get to the point where you have done that so much, and so much of your worldview is based on these things, and it's all
I'll
tied up in
add
your social circles.
extremely quickly because of
Yes.
social media, we're not digesting information like we're supposed to. And so
Right.
you're like, "Wait a second, this thing that so much of my education was built off of my understanding of history, like that these people were evil, that they're actually good guys, actually."
Right.
And you just buy
Right.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's exciting because you're like, wow, this is
Yeah.
really cool. Like now I have this secret thing that nobody else knows. And the thing is, it doesn't take a lot to know more about World War II than your average person. And
Mhm.
so I think Corey and Woe with Stone Choir and some of these other guys know more about World War II than your average person, because that bar is on the floor. And
Mm.
so that's all they feel like they need to do, is just know that much. And if they know more than their average person, then whatever extra crap that's false that comes with it that confirms the previous red pilling on some level, they'll just accept it.
Mhm.
And it can become so much a part of your identity and personality that you've built out for so long, and you can have so many social circles and so many of your values and how you see yourself built on this, that when someone comes along and says, no, you're wrong on this, they're questioning your personality, your essence as a person. That's how
Yeah.
it feels.
Yeah.
And so the cost of saying, no, I'm wrong, that's actually true, like the Holocaust happened and I was gullible, is so high.
Mm.
Because then it begs the question, okay, what else, if you are that capable of being gullible, and I think actually we all are on some level, it just depends on the topic. If you're actually that capable of being gullible, where else have you been gullible?
Mm.
And that is really, really scary.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Maller and Woe are, because you have to remember too, these guys have experienced at least some degree of um, discord in real life over this sort of thing.
Mm.
Like they've had
Yeah.
people,
They got
I'm sure they've,
excommunicated from a denomination, from a
exactly right.
tradition.
And so the more that happens, the more instantiated you are in this, that if you admit you're wrong on one thing, maybe you're wrong on all the rest of it. And maybe you were really wrong from the very beginning. And if that's true, then why should have anybody ever have listened to you? And was the last how many years of my life, wasted or in
Yeah.
pursuit of something wrong? Like that's such a high bar. It's such a high cost. And I think that's where guys like Maller are. I think to a much lesser degree, that's where guys like Joel Webben live. Um,
I wanna
is in
add
that
to
zone.
what you're saying, not disagreeing, but I think it's a very multifaceted reality when you bring up other personalities, which I was just thinking like, well, we've talked a lot about Stone Choir. At some point, we'll get to the other guys. But on the point about Joel Webben and guys like him, I've been talking about this recently on my channel, that there's just the reality of, and I just got comfortable recently calling Joel Webben a grifter, that all the evidence points to the like a bad version of a
Right.
grifter, like a um because when you what you win them with is what you win them to. And
Yeah.
you've got this audience now that shares so much of these things, and I think there's probably more so an element in the case of someone like Joel, that it's a matter of maintaining the audience that they've gotten. And that also is tough, because I'm not trying to say that Joel's not sincere, because I have people on different sides. Some say, he's not sincere at all. It's all just for money. But others say, he is sincere, but he's sincerely wrong. But I think that it's a mixed bag
It
of,
is.
yeah, I think that there are a lot of things in this line of thinking that Joel does believe. But I think, you know, when he's going to sleep at night and he's thinking that part there, I'm not sure about that, but I can't say that,
Well,
or even,
it probably doesn't start as grifting. What happens, in my opinion, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what happens, I think, is he believes some part of it, and then the financial motivations kick in, and that's when it becomes
yeah,
sort of a spiral. Because then I'm going to lose my audience if I, and you've pointed this out too, like I'm going to lose my audience if I move in what's considered a liberal or
yeah,
whatever direction on something, and so therefore I can't do that, and to keep the money flowing, I have to get
right,
edgier and edgier. And I don't think it's as simple as he doesn't believe it, he's just lying. I think he probably does on some level believe it, but I think he is um, severely biased on that basis because of
yeah,
the financial component. I think that's probably right.
yeah, yeah. So, are we finished? And I like this. We've kind of bobbed in and out. We probably won't have to wrap up with any other considerations on Stone Choir unless they come up naturally. But that my agenda, as
Yeah.
far as that goes, we've kind of weaved a lot of these different topics that I wanted to cover. Um,
I've
the
got one real good example of one more thing kind of related to the Holocaust or World War II history thing I can
Okay,
point out real quick, because this is not my goal with this interaction with you today is not to give you or to give your audience a huge overall superstructure case either direction, but more so help them understand the mindset of some of these people.
good.
Um, so here's one example. One of the things that you may hear from a lot of the guys denying the Holocaust is or denying the Holocaust occurred are claims that there were very silly um, claims made by either Holocaust victims or by officials following the war about the evils of the Germans
Mm-hmm.
that are like cartoonish. And
Mm,
so if that's the case, and it was in looking back on it, it was so clearly propaganda, um, we can then presume that claims about either gas chambers or mass murder broadly were also propaganda, right? That's one of the things that you may hear. And one of the examples of this is a claim that at Nuremberg, kind of like we mentioned earlier with Nuremberg, but at Nuremberg, that the Allies claimed that the Nazis created a nuke just so they could detonate it and kill 20,000 Jews. That's something that you may hear somebody say, right? And you think, okay, well that's silly, and it is silly. Um, and it's been passed around. There's probably thousands of people online in these circles that have heard this and shared it without a thought, because in their mind they've already kind of locked into this frame of, okay, well it was a atrocity propaganda, right? The whole thing. Um, but this one specifically, this claim is interesting because if you look into it, this was a claim that the Nuremberg investigators heard from the Germans themselves. And the Nuremberg trial, Justice Jackson, Mr. Jackson, was interviewing Albert Speer, a prominent Nazi administrator, and asked him about this. He says, "We've heard reports of a village, a small village being constructed, and 20,000 Jews put there, and then you guys nuked it, which is shockingly, bizarre because we didn't think you guys had nukes. What's going on here?" And and how Speer responds is he says, that's utterly impossible. And he believes that what happened was, and this is from his own perspective, that at the end of the war, the Nazis were lying to their soldiers and telling them that their country, the Germany, had developed super weapons that were going to turn the tide of war. And so Germany propagandized their own people into believing this story. so that they would believe that the tide of war was going to turn, even though it looked like there was no way they were going to win. They would still keep fighting.
Mm.
And that ended up in the Nuremberg record with the Allies being skeptical of this claim, and this Nazi administrator being clear that this was their own, or that he believed that this is their own propaganda about their own
Mhm.
super weapons, which didn't exist. Then this many years later is twisted into a claim that this was ever asserted as the Allies and was propaganda against the Germans.
Mm.
So that's just kind of an example of like when you're already in that mindset, when you're already looking for things because you have a vested ideological interest, when your worldview is positioned such that you have to disbelieve in the immorality of Nazi Germany, you will twist things like this, and you won't really care if it's true, or you won't investigate it, right? And you'll find things like this all over the place. And in my longer video, I hit tons of those
Yeah.
different topics. But anyway,
So I feel like we've talked a lot about as you've explained the history, their interpretation of the history. You're regularly you're getting into the details of the different perspectives argue over. And I think that in my opinion, you have laid out a positive case for the occurrence of the Holocaust. But is there any like specific things that you want to deal with first on like the positive, or that you haven't explained? I mean,
oh, I mean, nothing really for the, I think what you're trying to get out of this interview. So I'll just have to point people to that big 3-hour video,
yeah.
and you can leave this in too, and just to say my DMs on Twitter are open, and they're open for anyone that wants to message me. It's not restricted to anybody that I'm already following, or people that have um, uh, paid for Twitter or anything like that.
Mhm.
And I do that, and I do check the message requests on there every so often, because I want to hear from people who have questions. So if you see something online related to this topic and you want to have it assessed, let me know. I mean, I think that the best way to deal with a lot of this stuff is really just in a sober minded way, handling it um, based on whatever evidence is actually out there. Because there's just too much. There's too much noise. There's way too much in the way of people accepting these things based on their previous ideological commitments, and I don't want to be part of that problem. I want to see as much of the stuff as I can that's out there, and I want to make a case for my position from a historical perspective and arm people with that. So
Yeah. It's crazy because like I'm used to debates about you know, like nerdy debates about what is the extent of the relationship or the nature of the relationship between the particular Baptists of the 17th century and the Anabaptists of the Netherlands. And well, you know, we know that uh I think it was Richard Blunt, he visited, but was there any formal association beyond, such and such letter? We're not sure. And it's like, and people will sit here and debate like these niche historical things in my world,
right.
were you Reformed Baptist? Are you Baptist first or Reformed first? Like, did the particular Baptist come from the Anabaptist, or did they come from the Puritans in their congregationalism? You have like a major split over this issue, and it affects the way a seminary history professor is going to approach the topic. It's going to affect, I mean, so many things over that niche little thing, but relatively harmless discussions. Just, differences in traditions, differences in approaches to religious history, um, but differences that do not result in genocide or war or really, really harmful
Not
ways.
not in the last 100 years, but when it comes to Anabaptist, you could probably find some pretty nasty stuff.
Oh, yeah, I don't mean to make, like, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
yeah, the English Civil War and like, religious history we have our problems too. I'm talking about, like, today, debating
Yes.
about,
Yes.
um, like,
It
where
doesn't
the
hit the
Baptist
it
where
doesn't
yeah.
become as tangible. Yeah, I know what you
It
mean.
doesn't become as tangible, and it doesn't feel like it might result in someone maybe implying that the people that don't agree with you should be killed. Like, this feels like it has
Right.
societal implications, and, like, these are niche
Yes.
historical
Yeah.
disagreements among good scholars, but it's like that is another reason why this history matters, okay? The history
Yeah.
really, really matters, and, I just actually thought of another question, so listen.
Well, can I make a point about the how tangible these things are or
Go
aren't
ahead.
real quick?
Yep.
So, I would recommend and I've done it for a bunch of people that have reached out to me that are curious about these ideologies and why I care about these things.
Mhm. Yeah, why do you care about
I don't
them
know.
so much? It's all you talk about is in your
Yeah, no, that's a good. I don't know.
yeah.
I am a little bit obsessed with it at this point, and I don't know why that is, but I'd like to think that it's because it's an area where I feel like I'm doing some good. But regardless, I have pointed several people to the Buffalo shooter manifesto and the Christchurch shooter manifesto in New Zealand
Mm,
because I don't actually believe that Nazism is anywhere near reaching the level where we're going to have another Holocaust. Right? I don't actually believe that. I think that these ideas online are far more siloed than we maybe even give them credit for. Um, and that frankly, I've known so many of these guys in some of these groups who just don't have the guts to or the intuition to pull something like that off at scale.
mhm,
But what you do have are guys like the Buffalo shooter or the Christchurch shooter.
mhm.
And those are the guys who, if they had a pastor that was equipped to deal with what they were telling them, and a pastor that was open to having conversations with young guys who felt this way,
Hmm.
um, things might have gone differently. And if you
That's a
read
good
these
word, man.
manifestos, they're, I think the Christchurch is not that long. They're both like under 200 pages. I think the Christchurch one is under 100 pages. They're both about the Great Replacement. They're both about white genocide. They're both about the Jews.
Mm.
Um, and you will see when you go through these, I think both of these actually contain memes. There's like
Yeah.
several pages of memes.
Pepe?
Actually, not as much as the Pepe's. I'll defend the Pepe. I think Pepe is great. But
Oh,
anyway,
I love the Pepe, but I was thinking of a documentary I'd watched by the guy, the artist of the Pepe the Frog, and I couldn't it's been years
oh
since I watched it, but that
yeah,
he had referred to how Pepe became a symbol of it wasn't just like, "Oh, it got adopted by some weird people online," but, like, there were tangible, real world events that had taken
yes,
place, and Pepe's name was involved in it to see and I don't know if anybody is, even aware that Pepe actually started off as a really innocent, wonderful little comic that, a creative artist had drawn up, and it was adopted by that. Anyway, I interrupted you about the memes, but sorry.
oh yeah. No, you're good. I still think Pepe is innocent. I think Pepe is in the public domain. I want to appropriate and keep Pepe. But anyway,
Hey, you just gave me a
um,
thought. Maybe that's something we could pursue in terms of branding, you or me, or
yeah,
both.
there you go. But when you read these manifestos, and I think the Christchurch may not include memes, but it includes a lot of like verbiage that comes from memes. If you're aware of
Mhm.
the sort of dog whistle stuff that's out there. Um, but the Buffalo shooter has a section where he has what are made to look like uh, atrocity propaganda photographs that are photoshopped of the Holocaust. So pictures of like a guy standing on the edge of a tank, and he's just standing there looking out into the field, and there's nothing else really. And then another one where it's photoshopped, and a woman who supposedly is a Jewish woman is tied to the end of the tank cannon like she's about like a noose, like she's about to be hung and killed.
Mm.
And this is in one of these memes that the Buffalo shooter guy saw and felt like it was compelling enough to put in his document that he released out on the internet before he went and killed a bunch of people.
Mm.
That was somehow in his mind tied to those actions directly. And the saddest part about this is that this meme, this original negative of this photograph of this guy standing on this tank, that was never claimed by any institution as being an image of a guy hanging this Jewish lady. Someone online came later and photoshopped it themselves and then passed it off as this was propaganda by the Allies and see how the Holocaust didn't happen. And that's the kind of thing where actual truth and handling these topics, I think, can have tangible effect in the real world. I'm not saying that, like, if this guy had not seen this meme, that this would have never happened or something like that. But the apologia for Nazism is a fundamental part of the worldview of these guys before they go out and shoot up. In this case, it was I think a grocery store in Buffalo, New York.
Yeah.
So and if you read a lot of this stuff, I mean, it's hard to not see overlap between some of the rhetoric that you're seeing in some of these spaces, with race realism and that kind of thing.
Yeah, we're gonna get there.
And their beliefs.
Yeah.
So
before I ask a question, another question about post-war consensus, I'd like to know about how Martin Luther's writings, the Reformer, influenced the Nazis, or what people say about that. And I've heard, I think I've heard Mahler before talk about, but that essentially Hitler was trying to do what Luther had said, or that Luther had inspired him. Or so yeah, does Luther come up in Mein Kampf and or in any diaries that we have from either Goebbels or any of the Nazis?
So Luther is mentioned in Mein Kampf, kind of as like a general great historical figure. But I don't really actually recall necessarily how much he gets into when it comes to Luther's disdain for Judaism. And I say that kind of specifically like that because I think that Luther was pretty starkly different from the later Nazi conceptualization of anti-Semitism.
Focus on the religion.
Yes. So that's a big distinction. Best I can tell, Luther late in life, because earlier in life it seemed like he was pretty conciliatory. Maybe not the right word, conciliatory, but he was pretty. He wasn't as adamantly, I guess, hateful of Judaism and then Jews who practiced Judaism religiously. Earlier, he wasn't as much that earlier in his life, and then later in his life, he became much more hateful of them, and writing "And the Jews and Their Lies." And I know he developed, I think, a medical condition related to even his bowels that was pretty painful. And a lot of his writings, one of the things that scholars of Luther have noted is that his later writings became a lot more spiteful. And that, I think, influenced the degree of how vehemently he seemed to indicate that he had hatred for Jews. But at all points that I can tell, Luther held to those positions on the basis of the religion of Judaism. Whereas the Nazi conceptualization, just like they used any, or even though they used any cultural icon they could to propagate their worldview of Nazism, like Luther, was fundamentally different in that it viewed Jews as starkly immoral in their very essence on the basis of their race, like their genes, fundamentally. And there's even Dietrich Eckart, who was very close with Hitler and sort of considered like a proto-Nazi thought leader. He, in a very odd and cultic kind of way, wrote a book called From Moses to Lenin, where he depicted conversations between um, Hitler and other individuals. And in that, he depicts Hitler as believing that Luther was basically deceived by rabbis to translate the Bible. And what's funny is he doesn't understand the biblical languages, so he makes all kinds of mistakes relating to what languages or what translations he thought that Luther was doing. But basically, Hitler believed, according to Eckhart, that Luther was deceived by the rabbis to translate neighbor as neighbor instead of racial comrade. And that led to sort of a more universalist type of Christianity that later would be critiqued in positive Christianity, which is their sort of cultic, heretical fork of Christianity. It was sort of pseudo-Marcionist later on. And we know that there's that the Nazis believed or had a hatred for Jews on the basis of their race because their propaganda made this pretty clear. So like there's an image, and I can send you this too, but a propaganda image of a big fat Jewish looking guy, as you can imagine, like leaving a Catholic church, and we know it's a Catholic church because behind him is a crucifix. And he is looking over kind of in a supposedly lustful fashion at some like Aryan ladies down the street. And the caption on this propaganda, and then this guy that looks Jewish is also holding a Bible. So he's got a Bible with a cross. And the propaganda caption is, "Baptism did not make him a non-Jew." So the perspective is that the immorality of Jews was really a fundamentally racial thing, not that they could convert to no longer bear that kind of disdainful quality or whatever. So it wasn't fundamentally, well, I guess it might have been theological, but it was not. It wasn't like they viewed Jews as being folks that just happened to be deceived by a false religion who they were mad at because they wouldn't convert to Christianity, which I think you could probably sum up Luther as to some extent.
Well, now I'm regretting bringing up Luther because that would be a great segue into the race conversation, which I know you're fascinated by that, and we need some help parsing out the differences between having, a disdain for a religion as opposed to having a disdain for someone's race.
Right. Exactly.
So can we put a pin in that? Unless you had more to say on that, and you could.
Yeah, I mean that's the only thing that is really that connected to the Nazi conceptualization when it comes to Luther. I can read this one real quick passage by Himmler where he talks about how he says, "Today we are burdened by the question of denominations, the church, and Christianity. The Jewish question is no longer discussed today or discussed properly today. And yet people used to ask themselves, can a Jew who has become a Christian be treated so badly? Because of this religious bias, for a long time it was believed that the diversity of races could not be represented." Right? So it's a little bit confusing there, and the translation is a little weird. But the idea is that Himmler is lamenting the idea of Christians accepting Jews as Christians if they convert to Christianity, because he views this as like a roadblock to the Nazi sort of ultimate utopian vision, kind of like we've heard of Hitler conceptualized earlier in Mein Kampf. And in my mind, and based on what I know of Luther, that was not anywhere in the same universe of what Luther was thinking when he was angry at the Jews for, essentially in my mind, not converting to Christianity.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So, let's come back to race in just a second, but I wanna talk for a second about the post-war consensus, and I'll rant for a second about this. Um, Something that I heard from Jonathan Pageau on it, and then, I actually think this is important, getting back to the worldview question, because the stories that we tell ourselves are very often wrapped up in or represent ways of viewing the world. Um, and so I think that'll become clear in a second what I mean by that. So Jonathan Pageau, well, before I get there, I have to even say, Christendom and all the iterations of church state relations that we've seen throughout history, um, excuse me, the development and establishment of Western civilizations and America and modern liberal democracy, all the things that we know, they are held together by stories, but over time, that story has been less and less, sharing the same metaphysical assumptions that previous generations had when they set up their
Hmm.
policies. I've never had to put that in the plural. Their societies. Um, and so Jonathan Pageau has another one way of seeing it then would be we always agreed, or for the most part have agreed on, God is the highest good. And then over time we stopped agreeing on that as atheism became more and more prominent. Nietzsche is a big player here. So what we started to do was find ourselves in this position where we had to at least agree on the lowest evil. Well, if you don't have God, you don't have the devil because you don't really have a metaphysic. And so you look to the lowest earthly evil. And we agreed that it was Hitler. Now, Peugeot's point was that Hitler never was, nor could he ever be the actual devil. And then he even
Right.
compares, the Soviet Union and the atrocities committed over there as being actually paling in comparison. Um, I think he says that, but regardless, he says that there's just absolutely awful things, but we've made this symbol, um, the symbol for evil. We've made Mustache Man the guy, the kinds of thing to stay away from. And he said that story, especially because it's not an eternal story, just the story of God versus the devil, um, had an expiration date, like all earthly societal stories. And then he says, we didn't know when that expiration date was, but it just by virtue of the nature of what it was, it did have an expiration date. And then he toys with the idea of, are we seeing that um, story being questioned right now, that expiration date is here? Um, I think that it is here. I think that by and large, people are going to start to think about the nuances, and there's a sense in which that's a good thing that people are going to, like you said, they want to refamiliarize themselves with history. It's unfortunate that Stone Choir knows so much more about World War II than your
Right.
average person. We've assumed a lot of these things and just accepted the images of the story, but we probably should do some more thinking about it. And with that, Peugeot's point is that hopefully we just nuance the picture of Hitler, but that the pendulum doesn't swing too far in a radical direction to basically rewrite him as a hero, which is what we've been talking about. Mahler wants to say he was the last Christian prince. That this is actually the ideal. That is not the ideal, and that's not how we want to have the conversation about the
Right.
Holocaust. And so,
Right.
having said that, like, what are your thoughts about um, doing post-war consensus investigations to, this is tangential to it. I don't feel like this, in my opinion, before all of this stuff happened, we had been having conversations about whether or not we should trust Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's part of the Valkyrie
Right.
um, thing, and it's like I don't know. Sometimes I read Bonhoeffer, I'm like, was this guy a Christian? you know,
Right.
but that has nothing to do with Hitler. That's just like we're just dealing with his theology, but Um, so there's all sorts of ways in which we have to like talk about the post-war consensus. Talk about Churchill's part of that too. Like, well, you mentioned the Allies. Let's talk about the Allies. Like, what did they do right or wrong? None of that is Holocaust denial, as I see it. That's just a conversation. I've said before
Correct.
that this doesn't questions about the consensus does not require Holocaust denial, but
Correct.
mass genocide does. Or it seems to me that that's the pattern, that like that, as I've made the joke, like, oh, the Holocaust never happened, let's make it happen. Um, so what are your thoughts about how to go about thinking through the post-war consensus? And I think that can maybe serve as a segue into like a worldview conversation, getting back to what we were talking about earlier about the Nazis and
Yeah.
what they believed. And as this is like can be a Trojan horse into the hearts of young men, which is a whole other topic of conversation. We could talk about that probably for 2 hours, just about like the
Mm-hmm.
propaganda to the youth. And from the evangelical perspective, a guy like Wilhelm Busch
Oh, there you go.
and his ministry to the young men to try to cut this stuff off before it gets into their affections. So yeah, the story then, the story now, and then maybe getting into the worldview issue.
Yeah, so that's an awesome topic. I really I'm a little bit split on some of this because like a lot of things, depending on who I'm talking to, what you just described from Jonathan Peggio, I think has legitimacy, but it's also incomplete. So, for instance, I think one of the reasons that the West considers Hitler to be a satanic type figure, or like, and some people will say even more dramatically, like he almost replaced Satan or something like that,
Yeah.
um, is because our Western cultures have Christianity so ingrained in them, and even non-Christian cultures through common grace, to some extent, um, recognizing the immorality of Hitler,
Hmm.
that it seems obvious that we would just be rightly assigning a degree of extreme malevolence to that person. Like, I think that's just reasonable. So when people say we need to destigmatize Hitler or something like that, I don't feel compelled as a Christian, due to my personal political advantage or something that I'm trying to gain, um, to destigmatize somebody that I think actually does meet qualifications of being a very extreme evil. Now, I've had arguments with some folks that are more left leaning about how I believe that Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot and Mao, in my mind, all these guys are on top. They're on like a tier list. You have S tier, top tier, the top tier evil. I don't really sort them within that, and I don't really play that game. I think they're all just peak evil. It's hard for me to conceptualize beyond like within that
Yeah.
hierarchy. Um, and before Hitler, people would reference Nero or Attila the Hun
Mm.
or Napoleon or something like this. We've always had figures that
Well, I
we
think
have
Peugeot even
viewed.
brought up Napoleon, that he
Right.
over time became, yeah, not a good guy, but we don't hold him up. I think his point was just this is the guy that is the evil one. We don't talk about Napoleon that way anymore.
Yeah. No, I totally agree, and I don't think like if someone Napoleon's a little bit weirder because and I'm not. That's not the period of history that I'm super interested in, so I'm not quite sure to what extent Napoleon was as horrific as maybe he was depicted. A lot of times, Britain would have portrayed him in a certain way that who knows. Um, but if somebody was saying like we need to destigmatize Attila the Hun, it'd be like, well, that's a little bit odd because it sort of
Hmm.
over time has naturally occurred, and that's fine, and that will happen with Hitler, and there's nothing wrong
Hmm.
with that because people as we become further and further
I see.
removed in
You're talking
history.
about the project, the effort to do so. You're not.
Yes,
There's one thing to say over time things just change and the way people speak about these things change. That's
correct.
not the same thing as saying
Correct.
I'm on a war path to try to
Yes.
de-stick. Why are you after trying to rehabilitate this guy's image?
Right. And that is a distinction that I think is real. So like
Yeah.
And so when we get into the post-war consensus conversation stuff, it's one thing to recognize that this is happening. It's a different
Mhm.
thing to say, okay, we need to work to destigmatize Hitler,
Right.
right? And this would be like if somebody was saying in the past, we need to destigmatize Attila the Hun, and you're like, well, hold on, like my cousin got killed by Attila the Hun.
Right.
And you're like, that's kind of strange. Like maybe this guy has some motivations here. Maybe that's a little
Yeah.
weird, right? And he's like, well, no, actually, we need to destigmatize Attila the Hun, even though he killed your cousin, because um, it's clear that we can't believe uh, in the reality of Satan if we believe that Attila the Hun is evil, right? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now, it can make sense that in a secularizing society, we're going to try to look for figures in that role, and that speaks to the human heart that we're
Mhm.
always and on some level broad common grace that we are as humans built to recognize evil, and I think that when it comes to Hitler, we've properly recognized that in him, and over time, that will become less clear in our minds. It'll be less. We'll be less, I guess, traumatized by it. Kind of like you said earlier, you know. But if someone comes along and is very insistent that we need to destigmatize him, that does bring questions about what that person's motivations are, right?
And I wonder too, like the from where I'm coming from in conversations like this do involve political theological discussions, and um, it it becomes like so the people that I'm thinking of a lot of times when I'm talking about a lot of these issues are the people that are so used to politics and church conversations being like, "Don't worry about this world, only the next world matters." And so conservative Christians don't know how to think, I think a lot of times about like things like immigration, the economy and things like that. Um, because of that over separation, which is not what separation of church and state means. Um, you see what I'm saying there? Like that perspective.
Yes. Yeah.
And but on the other hand, I think like another interesting way of looking at this is from the perspective of the young man who doesn't maybe have a rootedness in the Christian worldview like we thought that this young man did. And the question would then be if he doesn't have a home in the world to come, he needs Hitler or some kind of. So I've also been wording it this way, like, okay, conservatives, right now, the division of the MAGA coalition, we want to know who the enemies are. So is the enemy just leftist ideology? Is the enemy, or pick a people group? Oh, the enemy would be illegal immigrants, not immigrants, but illegal immigrants. Or no, the enemy is um, the Jews. Well, now we have an
Right.
enemy. But with that comes your captain and your prince, your leader, something for young men to fight for. And I say this meaning what I just meant. I'm just this from the other perspective that at that point it's helpful to say your world is not here. I'm sorry, your home is not of this world.
Yes.
Hitler is not your prince. Christ is your prince.
Right. And Hitler's also not. Um, is my mic working?
Hmm.
Oh, sorry, I didn't light up for a second there.
Yeah, you know,
Hitler's also not, like you said, actually Satan either,
yeah,
right? Um,
right.
so I think it from that perspective, that's completely true. I do wonder sometimes, and this is a limiter based on my age too, because I'm like in my 20s. But I think sometimes we forget how recently who we would consider the political or even theological left has gained prominence in the West, in the U.S. specifically, more so. And what I mean by this is that I have a neighbor who is not a Christian, but is vehemently anti-communist, and in his generation, he's an older guy. I think he's like 90. I think it was much more common to have a broad recognition of the viewing like Stalinism or Bolshevism or the Soviet Union generally, if you were around during this Cold War, as being that sort of Satan figure.
Mm.
And as that has kind of exited as the Soviet Union fell in the 90s and stuff, what has replaced it from the left politically is like, once again, it's Nazism. And it's not that people in the 70s in the US liked Nazism or something. But we've kind of view the last 80 years of history as just like this straight line where it's like, no, I think that people throughout that whole period viewed the evils on the left pretty poorly. Like they thought that was pretty bad as well, and we've kind of just lost that in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah.
That's kind of my perspective on it. And so when people talk about the post-war consensus idea, it's like, well, there's an aspect of that that's true, that like people beat down ideas of nationalism because of, the Nazis. But I don't think in like the 70s that was happening as much, because most people were really afraid of the Soviet Union, and rightfully so.
Mm.
And so I feel like sometimes we're kind of reading the modern
Yeah.
left-wing political rhetoric back into the last 80 years of U.S. history, and that's not really necessarily fair.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, and there was something you said earlier about the tangible, and why would this matter? That, well, first of all, this is good versus evil, right? We're not saying that Hitler is the devil, but he was evil, and ideas have consequences and they matter. Like, regardless of, even if there isn't ever some mass atrocity in the future from this ideology. I mean, Paul seemed to really, and I don't remember Paul saying, "Oh, Timothy, you have to preach the truth, because if you don't, then there's going to be mass genocide." No, Paul cared about the truth,
Right.
because it was true, and I think that's something to keep in mind for guys like you and I, you much more, getting into the history of these things. Why do I? But it's the same is true for me when I talk about it from the evangelical side of it. More like, I had someone one time say, "Do you just wake up every day and all you think about is Joel Webben?" And I was like, kind of. But I don't know. I try to own it, but I also try not, I do my best to not, but I know that if I put Joel Webben in a thumbnail, it's going to get views, and that's back to the audience thing, but I do have an interest in this, and I would hope, and I try to pray and fight every day that it stays sincere. But I think the point is just, we we want to be able to proclaim the freeness of the gospel in a way that keeps and protects men's hearts from these wicked temptations, whether they result in blood or not. Because at the end of the day, it does have to do with, I don't know why, but I keep feeling like National Socialism comes up in the worldview question. I could be wrong, but even that is a political category. I guess my point is, you can't, it's a bad idea to do politics and pretend that you're not doing it from a worldview, what Christian or non,
Right.
that you are interpreting history and facts and data and policy on a spectrum of morality. You're either closer to what things ought to be like, or you're further away from what things ought to be like. And it's about an appropriate fullness of the relationship between you and your society's view of God and morality and nature as it tries to figure out the policy for the polis, if that makes sense. And on that note, like, I think Lewis is really, really, really helpful guy to immerse your mind in, because of where he was. We talked about Bart earlier, but Lewis would be a better option as someone who didn't like Hitler and was an evangelical And that's actually where I want to go in the channel is I want to focus more attention on Lewis as like, well, how did he think about this? And how did he think about fascism and communism and things like that? But he has this note in, I think it's l- learning and no, it's why I'm not a pacifist. He explains that basically he's not a pacifist precisely because of what he believes about heaven and hell. And
Mm-hmm.
so Lewis wasn't so pietistic that he was, too heavenly minded for any earthly good. He actually makes a case against pacifism because he realized that war pales in comparison to hell. And I just found that fascinating. But there is an appropriate way of approaching political theology, political issues, just war theory, pacifism, or fascism, any of these, ideologies that they want to get into our faith. So it's a politics pretending like it doesn't have any theological. It's completely theologically neutral. At that point, allows the ideology to slip into our theology.
Right.
A political and then it becomes a political theology, and it's sick. And you're not dealing with it at the worldview level, and so you're not allowing yourself to accept the fact that you're flirting with some sick things.
Yeah.
And um,
It threatens the purity and peace of the church,
yeah,
and that's the last section of my membership vows for the PCA
yeah,
is submitting yourself to the government discipline of the church and promising to study its purity and peace.
yeah.
So that's kind of where I see that fitting into this. And like you mentioned Lewis a second ago, he's got a great quote kind of about you're talking about these pernicious ideologies that work themselves into Christianity by sort of pretending at first to not really be morally charged, right? And he talks. This is a letter from. I'll read just a brief section of this if it's cool. From Lewis to Bede Griffiths in 1940. So this is like before World War II really started like going big time with us entering. He says fascism and communism, like all other evils, are potent because of the good they contain or imitate. Diabolus simius Dei. And of course, their occasion is the failure of those who left humanity starved of that particular good. This does not for me alter the conviction that they are very bad indeed. One of the things we must guard against is the penetration of both into Christianity,
Mm.
availing themselves of that very truth you have suggested and I have admitted. Mark my words, you will presently see both a leftist and a rightist pseudo-theology developing. The abomination will stand where it ought not.
Who is that?
That's C.S. Lewis writing to Bede Griffiths, January 17th in 1940.
That's amazing. Well, what a quote.
Yeah, I think so too. I like a lot.
Jeez.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really like what you're talking about with that. Like that's I want to fight leftist and rightist pseudo theologies that are a threat to the purity and peace of the bride of Christ.
And Lewis had this. You listen these things. He too listed a bunch of things. He said fascism, communism, pacifism. He said all of these things. Um, they're like these band-aids you put over the whole world, and you're like, I just came up with this ideology that just fixes all the world's problems.
Exactly right.
And
They're a contrary gospel. The gospel
yeah,
fixes everything. These pretend to fix everything as well.
bingo. Yeah, he says if you want to be a good dentist, you don't say I'm going to try to heal or a good doctor every person that has ever lived. Or not ever
Wow.
lived. You know what I mean? Ever lived or every
Everybody
person on the
alive.
planet. Yeah. Um, he said, but if you want to be a good dentist, you try to heal that one toothache. He said, and then you can say, and I'm paraphrasing, but then you can say that that person has saved the world. And
Yeah.
that's because they're just doing their job. And this gets back to that, coram deo, living before the face of God in your vocation, doing what God's called you to do, and getting back to the heart of the young man. Like, no, there is no one um, answer fixes all solution for this world outside of Christ and in his time.
Amen. There is one thing I'll touch on real quick when you talk about worldview, and because I'm the Nazi guy, and that's what this is about. We can go through this. Is that The Nazi movement was really influenced by Marcionism. So their perspective, and we see this even in the Bibles that were funded to be created by the regime, that had the Old Testament removed and had portions of the New Testament taken out too. It was that the goal in what they called positive Christianity, which was their sort of heretical fork of Christianity, their cultic thing, was to remove the Jewish influence on the Bible. That was what they wanted to do. And they some of the early Nazi thought leaders like Rudolf Jung wrote and said that the Old Testament was like filled with the Jewish spirit, and that he didn't like that, right? So he says the church Christianity represents is an invaluable ally for the Jews. It has taken the teachings of Jesus the Galilean, the content of which comprises the most supreme selflessness and a belief in the benevolent Father in heaven, the All Father. So he ties it into some actually pagan language there, and has garnished them with various ingredients sourced from the racial mishmash dwelling in the Western Asia and on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. So he thinks that the Jews like basically used Christianity as a tool, and that the Nazis were going to restore authentic Christianity, which looked closer to Marcionism. It has also associated these teachings which constitute a revolt against Judaism and its spirit with the Old Testament, the same Old Testament in which the Jewish spirit finds its purest expression. Furthermore, it has equated the All-Father of the Savior with the Jewish God Yahweh. And later on in the same passage, Rudolf Jung also talks about how belief in a single God is a fraud, essentially. So he believes in an all-father, but because they're more panentheist, that includes all of nature. So it's like a lot of things going on, more than just a monotheistic view. The thing is that's tricky about this is that the Nazis aren't exactly the most consistent thinkers in the world. So you have guys like this that will call monotheism a fraud, and then later talk about the All Father as if it's a singular thing, right?
Yeah.
And so someone will dispute when you say, okay, well, he looks like he wasn't a monotheist. Like, well, look at this passage. It's like, well, at least I guess that passage he sounded like he was, because frankly, a lot of it is gobbledygook. But what it definitely isn't is little o orthodox Christian doctrine. It's definitely not what it was.
Yeah.
Jung also goes on and talks about, he says, Jesus founded no church and no priesthood. He was instead the bitterest enemy of Yahweh's priests. And he goes on to kind of poo-poo on Protestantism as well.
Which is happening today.
Right. So, and Wagner recorded Hitler as directly stating that the Old Testament was suffused with a materialistic ethos that is not our ethos, in reference to like the Nazi ethos.
Their ethos was very materialistic.
Well, that's the irony, right? So, but when they say materialistic, you have to understand they don't mean always like philosophically or theologically materialistic. They're thinking materialistic in terms of wealth. So they're tying that to Bolshevism and the reduction of viewing mankind down to financial like equality.
Okay.
So yeah, I know that's funky, but that's one of those areas where that's different maybe in what they mean. But it's hard to tell.
Yeah, so on the I was talking to Will Spencer the other day, and we just kind of went down this rabbit mm, not rabbit hole, but just like this topic about, man, it like the 20th century was full of these ideologies. And all these ideologies were rooted in extreme, like, I keep saying deformed, not reformed, but deformed ideologies,
Mm-hmm.
um, or philosophizing ways of putting the world together. and National Socialism would be one of them. And to see it popping, well, and that's my question: is like, is National Socialism a possibility in the future, just ideologically speaking? Not saying it would ever be like on the table, but like for as a legitimate political theory for to capture the hearts and minds of young men.
Well, it depends on what so National Socialism, which Nazi is like a take on. That's kind of like the slur or whatever. Um, Although historically Nazis kind of embraced that, so it's kind of disputed on what that really means. But anyway, um, National Socialism in its barest sense, if you're just a really, really, um, it's hard to not just say autistic. If you're like a really autistic poli-sci guy, okay, you're gonna think, oh well, that's uh, socially right-wing authoritarian and uh, economically control economy. That's what they'll think, and that's totally possible. And we're seeing that shift on the right wing today. When it comes to like widespread beliefs about grand Judaic conspiracy or whatever, I don't see that as taking hold to the degree that it has historically in the West. I just don't see that as being a possibility. I think that um, there it would require and it did in Germany, it would require a people that were so extremely demoralized and looking for something to grasp onto, um, that I don't see that happening in the West, short of like some sort of extreme societal collapse. And there are people in some of these movements who would consider themselves accelerationists, who view that as being the most possible avenue for creating the world that they want to create, because they see that would be required to make things so bad or drastically worse, such that people will be more willing to accept something like widespread Jewish oppression or whatever.
What's the relationship between National Socialism and accelerationism, like at an idea level?
I mean, really, insofar as I understand it, it has a lot more to do with how people after World War II, the sort of esoteric neo-Nazi guys who wanted to revive Nazism, how they wanted to achieve that. I think it has way more to do with the pragmatism regarding that than it has to do with the Nazi ideology itself at core. So it's more like an avenue more than it's a.
Okay, so we could see like these political theories, like National Socialism, accelerationism, or no enemies to the right. And
Right.
I'm asking you, correct me if I'm wrong, as avenues. Is that a good word for it?
Yeah, they're tactics
They're
basically. Yeah,
tactics.
I view accelerationism as a tactic, not really so much an ideology. Now you've got guys like Nick Land that are super weirdo individuals, just very strange, eccentric people, who may have some sort of idea of accelerationism as an ideology in and of itself. But most of the time, people talk about accelerationism online. They're talking about wanting societal collapse because in the resulting destruction, they think they have a better shot for their niche ideology to arise as the one that's going to be on top. And you see this from leftists too. And this is kind of, you get some of this in the Bolshevik Revolution concept too. And that's actually more baked into left-leaning political ideology more than the right in a weird way, when it comes
That's
to
very strange.
the idea of the revolution. So
So I see a that's helpful. So at a political theory level, something like National Socialism back then and accelerationism now are avenues for the worldview to be expressed.
pretty much, yeah. Yeah, I
Okay.
think so. Um, yeah.
And so I'm thinking of this just in trying to taxonomize for people. Um, I think that race does come up there.
Yeah, it does. I mean, there's the whole there are definitely camps of people who view a race war as being like inevitable, and so if it's going to be inevitable anyway, the faster we can make it happen, So like the viewpoint is that multiracial societies are impossible
Yeah.
because racial diversity destroys society. This is not a solvable problem, and so therefore we need to accelerate race war because the sooner we have a race war, the more white people will be around. In the case of the right wing side of things, to uh, fight in it. And so we need a race war quicker rather than later because if we have one 60 years from now, then there won't be enough white people in the country per capita to win.
Let
So
let's go here.
I know that sounds ridiculous, but there's a lot of
Yeah.
people that actually think about this.
Yeah. No, I agree. Diversity is the problem. That's a creedal statement of sorts.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah. I mean, it's usually used that broadly, but depending on what group you're talking about, different people are going to take that to mean um, racial diversity versus religious diversity. Like
Yeah.
a hardcore theonomist may hear that and think, okay, we're talking about just diversity of religions. And
Yeah.
then somebody who may be more oddly enough, kind of more in my camp, like I do believe that uh, multiculturalism, I think that extreme cultural diversity isn't healthy for a country. I believe that. Um, but then there's a sect of people that hear that and think, oh, okay, diversity of racial genetics in your country is a bad thing, right? That's an intrinsic evil in some way, and that can go back to their perspective on like what a nation even really truly is fundamentally. And if they view it as a family, like an extended genetic family, um, then in their mind, it's getting worse if you don't have some sort of like genetic
But
purity at
but there's
scale.
there's it's it's like an and/or kind of thing with the race, and so like the race can be part of a worldview, and it's also can be part of a political strategy.
Yeah, I mean, voting, at least in like representative democracies, it makes sense demographically to split people up by races because I think people do sort of naturally put themselves in those buckets anyway, and so it becomes a demographic that you compete for, base kind of, and if you have a supermajority that's upset like in Nazi Germany, you can inspire them and get them to believe whatever you need to, and sort of deploy them politically. You see this with La Raza, with like Mexicans and stuff too. It's like this. It's not a unique problem to Nazi Germany. The hyper racial identitarianization of politics.
Right. But we can camp out a little bit on accelerationism and no enemies to the right. Um, seeing it as an avenue and then saying that bit about race and how race does for a lot of them fit into it. Not all of them. Am I wrong about that? Like not all of them are racists.
Not all of whom.
The accelerationists, the no
Oh
enemies
no
to
no
the right.
no no, definitely not. Like I said, accelerationism is in my mind more of a tactic
Yeah,
than
it's
it
a
is an
tactic.
ideology. Yeah.
So and just for the record for me, because I don't know if I've posted this before on X, but I don't know if I've said this in a video. I'm sure you'd agree that monoculture is not inherently sinful. Diversity is not inherently sinful. Moving on.
Right.
Now, when you take it to the worldview level slash political strategy, or say something like you said, diversity is the problem. You didn't say that, quoting somebody. That here's a belief that if you believe that, then you could fit nicely in something like no enemies on the right, which, in my opinion, is unbiblical.
Yeah, I mean, I
So
guess I
quickly,
also view Netter as a tactic, though, primarily.
but
No
but
enemies to the right.
an unjust tactic.
Yes, yeah, it's an unjust tactic because I believe as Christians, it binds our consciences to ignore immorality on the basis of our political ends.
So
That's what's wrong with it.
define quickly, because we keep saying it, and I'm thinking of people that I know personally that are going to benefit from this episode. People in my church. Um, define for me, for us, what is accelerationism and no enemies on the right, and then you can maybe use that as a jumping off point into giving some other names outside of the Stone Choir. You've already mentioned a couple of them, but tell us, define that and who the key players are in that movement.
Yeah, so I already kind of talked a little bit about accelerationism and defined that. I don't know how much that ties in really here directly, but when
Okay.
it comes to no enemies to the right, the abbreviation is NETTR, generally just vocalized as netter. And then there's an alternative one which is
On.
NEOTR, yeah, which
On.
is no enemies on the right. People don't usually say neoter though because it doesn't really read as well.
They did that to soften it, because they got criticized so heavily, and they were like, "Well, not to, but
Yes.
on."
And weirdly enough, I almost consider I think the Neoter is almost worse because there's more people on the right than there are to your right at any given time if you're assuming you're on the right at all.
It's a
And
great
so
point.
you're basically just adding more people to this list of individuals that you are not allowed to apply biblical moral judgment to because of how they either vote or signal politically in public. And the the best way I can steelman both of those positions, the tactic of no enemies to the right or no enemies on the right, is that um, they would say that you should not publicly condemn or castigate a person on the basis of immorality or whatnot if they happen to be on the political right or to your political right.
Yeah.
Um, I don't see what seems odd to me about this is that well, first off, I think it does. I don't think it works. So if you're talking just tactically, I don't think it actually works for you, because it becomes pretty clear when you avoid um, objective criticism of anyone on your who you consider your team, um, because it one of the most powerful rhetorical strategies is pointing out clearly and precisely how a person is being a hypocrite. Um, that's one thing that people have sort of ignored, but I do think it actually is true from just a rhetorical perspective. Um, but I think that public application of biblical morality is deeply important and is more important than short-term political wins.
Mm.
Because I think that over a long enough timeline, what will ultimately cause our culture to be closer to the character of Christ is if we apply biblical moral principles um, impartially um, rather than selectively to win politically in the short term.
Mhm. Yeah, and I I do I see a lot of overlap between that and accelerationism.
Okay, help me understand what you mean.
And maybe I'm misunderstanding accelerationism, but the idea that we need to do anything and everything to replace what we have with something new, so it needs to burn. We need to accelerate this
Oh,
process,
right. Okay.
and that too, coming back to the ends justify the means. And so Nick Fuentes
Yes.
even recently said, I think you and I talked about this, like, I actually I like that Zoran Mondani is the mayor of New York City, because that gets us closer to overthrowing the whole thing.
Right. Right.
He's gonna
Yeah, it
burn it down.
depends on how nihilistic you are for sure. And I think that you're correct that netter and accelerationism both are tactics that are significantly more concerned with ends above means. I think that's definitely true. And I think that biblical morality is extremely concerned with means as well as ends. Um, Now, to whatever extent, I mean, there's a million different moral philosophical hypotheticals that you can
Yeah.
come up with to kind of play out where someone's line on that is. But it is very odd to encounter somebody who so plainly will say, like, I will not morally castigate anybody who either votes this way or signals to me that they are politically one direction or another.
Hmm.
That's rather I don't know. It strikes me as evil. Kind of hard to figure out exactly like why, but it just does, because it just seems to subjugate morality so far beneath
Yeah,
just kind of like hyper pragmatism, which
yeah.
I find disgusting.
That's a byproduct of the 20th century. Pragmatic strategy, war.
Right.
And I haven't thought about this. This is a thought fresh out the oven, but I think we need to read more about Machiavelli.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Well, some of these guys will just say the right needs to be more Machiavellian.
yeah,
I don't know
yeah.
if you've seen that, but
Hmm.
there's a
Yeah.
couple guys that
That's
have
why
said that
I recently
directly.
got a
So
book on him so that I could learn a little bit more about him. And I was like, wow, my understanding is that he didn't believe that there was such a thing as Christian political like theology. That was just
sure, just
yeah,
power.
yeah, just
That's
power.
it. That's all that
So
mattered. Yeah.
how are accelerationism and net are different? They're both strategies, I'm hearing you say, but how
Well,
are
I
they
think that
different?
you can practice no enemies to the right in the hopes that you will win without a requirement for a societal collapse,
Okay.
or like mass institutional collapse or something, I guess.
So let's paint.
Um,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish.
no, that's all. That's pretty much all I was gonna say. What were you saying?
Let's paint a picture of a Cthulhu monster or some kind of multi-tentacled robotic monster, because I think technology is a big part of this. We can't even get to, but it's got a bunch of different arms, and one of those arms is like conflating race and religion. One of those arms is maybe in the past National Socialism. Another arm is netter accelerationism. Maybe
Right.
I'm wondering, is that monster, is the main body of the monster, is it Christian nationalism? And like all these things are just like expressions of it. And maybe
I don't
even
know.
innocent tentacles too. You might have a couple of it's like, oh, patriotism. Um,
Yeah. I mean,
when
I would say I don't know. I would say that I wouldn't be so like, I don't think that a branch of from Christian nationalism would be like National Socialism, because I
that's
don't
fair.
think that Christian nationalism is, if it is actually Christian, I don't think that it is a root part of that same tree.
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is what is Christian nationalism?
Title
No,
card.
not our
There you
guy.
go.
What is, huh?
That's a title card. There you go.
Yeah.
Um,
Do you
I
want to? I'm going to have someone on here soon defining it, but would you like to take a stab at it? Because and let me explain. Like Christian nationalism used to be a very niche conversation that has mind-blowingly exploded in the last like 4 or 5 years. It is a very big tent popular thing now, and it's becoming increasingly undefinable. And the reason I use that monster illustration is because there are things, and there's probably a better analogy, but there are things in the movement that don't define everyone in the movement, but are like hitched and like wedded to this thing, whatever it is. And based on what someone had for breakfast, you'll get a different definition. One definition might sound more accelerationist, but another one might just sound more patriotic.
Well, there's currently a bunch of people competing for what that is on the
True.
right. So like I actually am much more comfortable with theonomy than a lot of people are. I think that you could probably make a case for theonomy that is biblical.
I have a lot of
Um
theonomists that watch my channel, and I'm really happy about that, by the
yeah.
way, because it's like I
So
think that's an in-house disagreement for sure.
yeah, and so that's kind of where, like, based on that, if theonomy is a subsection of Christian nationalism, then there I am. Then I'm a Christian nationalist. And there are people, I think, like Doug Wilson, that would have a much wider view of Christian nationalism as a term, who may put me in that camp under that, and himself as well. Um, But I've also heard things from him sort of toward the direction of like, well, at some point Christian nationalism may become so poisoned a term that um, it can't be used in that way.
That's
Now
where I'm at.
the real serious question on that is everybody's talking about, is Christian nationalism Christian? Well, it's like, well, what is nationalism? And there are a lot of people that are vying right now to define Christian nationalism as really being just like white nationalism with Christian people. That's what a lot of people are
Yeah.
understanding it to be. I don't think nationalism is intrinsically racial, because I on some level am not a pure, like, an ethno nationalist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that nations are entirely based on an ethnicity or something like
Mhm.
that, based on the like very definition of the term. I don't think that's the case. Um, but I do think there are some points about nations being akin to families that are valid, that are not always taken to their furthest conclusions, in the way that they should be if we're being authentically Christian. Um, so in a weird way, according to the left, I guess I would be a nationalist.
Mhm.
Um, but I am not a white nationalist,
Yeah.
and I would like a Christian government. And I
Okay.
and so there I am. There's the term applied to me. Um, but if you have a lot of people that have accepted the term and put it in their Twitter bio already, Christian nationalist, CN, whatever, and then somebody can come along and subtly redefine it as meaning white nationalist who happens to claim to be a Christian, um, then a lot of people will leave it in their Twitter bio and start getting attacked by the left over it and decide to go ahead and be that.
Mhm.
And I think that's what's going on from a rhetoric perspective right now, is trying to capture that term. And so there's a dialogue on like, at what point is it should it be given up, or what does it mean? Because it's not just theonomy. We know that, mostly we know that. But to the
Yeah.
left, it is basically everything that is,
It's
um,
saying God bless you in public if someone
right,
sneezes.
exactly. To the left, it's like, who
It's
knows?
posting the 10 commandments in schools, which would be a really good idea, but,
Right,
"Oh, that's Christian nationalism." It's like, I guess so, if you know, but,
right. And
um,
this is the issue with letting the left, I think, define those things.
I I tend to really buy into James Lindsay's idea that it was a Mott and Bailey switch, and a term, invented, and you adopt the term so they can say, "See, aha, see?"
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you might not be the biggest fan of some people, but I think the idea of that is helpful.
Yeah, no,
I don't know if that's reflecting going on, but
I think it's a bait and switch, but I also think like all terms kind of go through this phase. And I
mhm,
don't know how much you remember about like the older theonomy discussions, but there was a period where people were declaring other people to not be truly theonomist, because they believed that we could execute criminals by
yep.
shooting them instead of stoning them. And the argument was, were our bullets actually akin to stones in the Old Testament, right?
I mean, some of
So
them, they got into arguments about mixed clothing. I mean, they
yeah,
the
I haven't heard that one, but that
the
one's
economy
super
got really
bananas.
heated at during those years. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the kind of thing where you can get like, in that, I think we're in the same stage on this.
yeah,
And honestly, I don't know if that ever got resolved. And so I don't know if this one is ever going to get resolved. And if it turns out that we just get defined on the right by whatever the left wants to label us as, then basically everybody who's politically involved and a believer is going to be a Christian nationalist. I'm not saying that's a
yeah.
good thing to let them do that, but I think that's kind of where things may be headed in terms of how we define it. Just kind of, and that kind of worked the other direction with people on the left being considered woke. You know?
You don't want woke right? How
No,
does
I mean
the term
more
work?
so like everybody on the left. Um, the term woke was assigned to the left by the right successfully, and it wasn't. There were a lot of people on the left that probably didn't want that label, that ultimately got put on them, and they couldn't avoid it, um, culturally and at scale. And I think the same thing is happening with the right and Christian nationalists.
I tend to be of the mindset that adopting the term and trying to redeem it plays into their hand. and it would be better to come up with something else. Maybe that might be dangerously similar, but something else that doesn't have the
Yeah.
gangrene, and that's what I'm after right now is mere
Well,
Christian.
the trick is to. I'm sorry, you said you're after mere Christian.
Yeah, I'm trying to pursue a mere Christianity.
Yeah, I think that the trick, if you're going to make a new term for a political um, ideology of sorts, is to make sure that you don't give anybody uh, don't let anybody fly the plane who's a total nut at the beginning.
Yeah.
So
um, okay, so how do we? I mean, regardless of what we think about Christian nationalism, accelerationism is bad news.
yes,
Netter is bad news.
yes, thumbs
It,
down,
thumbs down.
thumbs down, Nutter, thumbs down, accelerationism. I want to live in this country. I have a
Yeah.
family. I don't want societal collapse. I want to be able to apply uh, my moral beliefs that I believe are derived from Scripture equally and apart from political machinations.
And Holocaust denial or denial of its occurrence, it may not result in genocide, but it will contribute to the chaos. And that's a tangible civil instability that I don't want that kind of world for me or my kids or theirs.
Yes, and it's a symptom, not a cause. Is what it is. It's not. Um, People aren't coming to these conclusions because they got convinced the Holocaust didn't happen first, and then like later end up turned around on everything else. They have to believe that it didn't occur because it's one part of the superstructure that they've kind of built in their minds that they have to maintain.
A world without God. This
Well,
superstructure and this. So Charles Taylor, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He talked about the social imaginary. So this is the a culture's wide held beliefs and things that we believe without even thinking about it. Things that just we just assume. And getting back to the post-war consensus idea is that has been part of our social imaginary. When we stop agreeing on that, that's when um, civil war potentially happens or some kind of chaos. Because if we don't agree
mhm.
on what's good, we don't agree on what's bad. That's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and you can ask people who don't believe the Holocaust occurred, and this is kind of to your joke earlier a little bit, but like, do you think if it did, it would be a bad thing? I mean, that's a lot of them won't tell you yes to that question. Um,
Well, and
and usually it'll be some sort of dodge, but
I want to get there in a second because I'm going to ask what advice you would give to fathers parenting their children right now. But my point is to what we were just saying that the ideologies. You said something just now, like the Holocaust denial is a symptom, not a cause. That they need that because it fits within the superstructure that they have built.
right, it's
Um,
part of their identity.
so back to what I was saying about my conversation with Will earlier. I asked him, I was like, man, what do we do? What, how do we keep from something like national socialism, whether it's accelerationism or anything else, um, grip their hearts? How do we do that? How do we keep a society? Of course, this is in God's hands, but I'm just talking about from our perspective of our responsibility, what ought we do as a church and our testimony and in our witness to prove and keep it from history repeating itself, and like the 20th century in a lot of ways was such an anomaly. There's so many things happened, the Industrial Revolution, and I mentioned Bart, and then socialism, Soviet Union, so many things, the world wars, like I mentioned these scholars that talked about this time being traumatic, but another scholar, um, I'm just gonna go ahead and say I'm actually gonna be able to interview him. We're in the process of getting this hooked up, but Dr. Michael Haken, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he made this passing comment in class. I remember he said, and it's kind of influenced the way that I see, I think, a lot of what I'm doing. He said that the 20th century and the wars were the most barbaric, were some of the most barbaric years. And I don't remember exactly what he said, so I don't want to botch what he said. But if memory serves, like some of the most barbaric wars in history, and that in line with the trauma side of it. And so, how can we kind of like move forward? I think there's a sense of like a false sense of peace that like because of the trauma and because of like the issues and yeah, after you mentioned after the war, then there started to be like subset extremist groups that
Right.
just stayed hidden. It feels like this never really ended. So it's like, well, we said never again, but it wasn't actually even over. It just got hidden. And of course, we know that this is over when Jesus comes back, of course. But I'm saying that could we maybe get away from these godless ideologies being such like widespread appeal? And I recognize that there's a small group of people that are making these things happen, but radicals are the leaders of the movements. And Will mentioned something about like the statistic of like over time, the percentage of radicals stayed the same, but it was the people who were indifferent that actually made the difference because they just didn't say anything.
Uh-huh.
And so my question is just like I'm just thinking out loud, like what could we do as a society to keep us from falling into the same traps? And we kind of were like, I don't know, pray a lot. Like, so my question to you is what are your thoughts about how we can move forward? Is it just, hey, let's dive into the Christian nationalism thing, redeem that, but then like properly define it, or what do we do? What do you think that we should do?
I think we this is going to sound trite, but I don't think it really is. I think we have to fight lies with truth, and I don't think that means just bludgeoning people by telling them they're wrong over and over again. I think that actually means like directly handling and addressing the issues that they have and explaining why they're wrong or why their perspective is wrong or why, you know, down to the level of the memes.
Mm.
Like that's the only thing that I've seen be successful in the messages that I get from guys that have come out of some of this stuff or were really wrapped up in this kind of stuff before.
Also, you're
Like
funny. You're funny
I'm
on
funny.
X.
Oh,
And
good. Well, that's yeah.
I don't know if this is where you're getting at when you mentioned the memes. I apologize if so, but I feel like you have a way of like you feel like one of the boys. And I think that goes a long way too, is like I just want to know that so and so can take a joke and that he's one of the guys, and then we could talk about my bad beliefs. Has that
Yeah.
do you feel like that you've developed a sense of camaraderie with people as you talk with them about their views and they change them?
Well, some of it is like I joke with Neil Shinvey that I'm his alt-right Sherpa. Like I'm the guy that will kind of take him on the tour of all these weird niche internet things and on the dissident right. And I in the same way that what's the passage about becoming hold on, let me try to find it.
In the Bible?
Yeah, hold on, you can cut this part out.
I'm probably not going to.
Becoming all things to all people in 1 Corinthians. There
Yeah.
you go. I think there's something to be said about that where I think sometimes the reaction to these young guys is just sort of general abhorrence of the belief and not understanding where it's coming from within these guys. Like you ought to be able to steelman the neo-Nazi white nationalist guys' positions. You ought to be able to do that if you're gonna like try to witness to these guys and talk to these guys. And I think that too many folks who are finding themselves in a position where they're having to deal with either these guys at their church or even their kids or something falling into this, they're not able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually does take it takes energy and effort to get yourself in that mindset and understand that culture enough to really reach people in that culture. Um, the internet stuff is especially difficult because it is so crass, and so it's hard to try to maintain
Yeah.
um, righteousness when you're in that environment. And I struggle with that too, online, and the degree of harshness that I treat people, and um, praying to be, asking God to help me be more kind, which is tricky because a lot of these subcultures value abrasive and aggressive confrontation, and that makes sense because it's all boys.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how to do that in a way um, that glorifies God and can speak to what these guys are feeling is tricky. But you got to be able to do it if you're going to witness to them. There's just no other way to do it. And be like I said, I've seen better results with some of these guys just directly confronting a lot of the historical memes or memes about Jews or whatever than I have had anything else. Because if you try to psychoanalyze them and say, why do you feel that way? Like, whatever, they're not going to give you anything that's going to be helpful to try to reach them. You got to actually contend with the arguments that are being made. And in that process, you'll understand them more and figure out kind of where they're coming from.
So I think, and maybe I'll change my mind on this. Maybe you're changing my mind on this, but I think that I have basically said, on the face of it, something that sounds almost like the opposite of what you just said.
Okay. Well, good.
And
Let's talk about it.
like, they don't care about the historical details, and arguing with them about the historical details isn't going to change their mind. But I mean, you probably, now that you're talking, I'm like, well, you probably have examples or stories that you could tell about cases in which that has happened, where you've said, let's talk about that fact. Where are you getting that?
I don't think it's necessarily that what you're going to do is somebody's going to share a Holocaust meme with you and you're going to send back some neo-Nazi document from 1937 and it's going to be like they snap and they're like, "Oh my gosh, you're right." Like this, I don't think it works like that. But like I mentioned before, if you have this, they have built this superstructure in their mind, and one significant portion of that is World War II history. One portion of that, which I'm sure you've talked about or will talk about, is the kind of manosphere view of women or something like this, right? You got to fight through that stuff to get deeper into understanding what they think about things and why they feel that way.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that what kind of shakes people out of it and they realize what they've really gotten themselves into is one of those parts of that superstructure collapsing and forcing them to be introspective. And we see this, there are people who, were atheists and came to Christ.
True.
And Christian apologetics is a significant part of their
True.
conversion. I know for me it was. And I wouldn't say that I had one moment where I was like, somebody made a Alvin Plantinga argument to me or something, or somebody gave me a William Lane Craig argument about cosmology, and then it just clicked, and then I was like, I'm a Christian now. It's little by little, it's areas, it's these spiritual strongholds, also intellectual strongholds in people's minds that you tear down.
You just you made dots connect in my mind. So probably in or around, just before or around the time that I started getting interested in the theonomy thing and read all up on that, and was also, it's in that too, the theonomy issue, let me just say, It's it's presuppositional epistemology or Van Tillian epistemology applied to political theory or political policy. So we can't do X, Y, or Z without chapter and verse. We need special revelation God to explicitly say if we're going to do blah blah blah, so that in the judicial law, here are the laws. So it says this here, so we apply this here, and then you have debates about, like you said, shooting or stoning. But the general idea is all based on something that doesn't require natural theory. It requires special
Right.
revelation to inform policy.
Right.
That was something you didn't ask for. Nobody did. The presuppositional side of it, just at an apologetic level, I was fascinated in that conversation, and basically have kind of come away and been like, I don't know, I guess I'm a Thomist, I'm a Van Tillian. I don't know how. That's a whole other conversation. My point is, we talk a lot about the use of evidences, which is what we're talking about right now. We're
Right.
talking about evidences to prove the existence of something or whether or not something happened or was or is. And then the worldview thing, which Van Til's point was, well, you can't properly interpret any of those evidences without the worldview. And I've said this, like, I think essentially if you come away from the Bonson and Sproul debate, they both believe that logical inconsistencies are sin.
Right.
But one gets at the one from the many, and the other gets to the one from the to the many from the one, if that makes sense. Or however you want to
Yeah.
slice it, they both believe that it's a sin to
Right.
have a logical deduction that's illogical, or syllogism that's illogical. And I think this might be something similar, which really, that's why I'm rambling right now, because you got me all excited. That it's not. Yeah, and maybe the way to couch this too might even be like the richness of like availability, listening, and friendship. That if an older man is talking to a younger man and he wants to try to persuade him that his views are like gangrene,
Yeah.
then he needs to feel it out, pray a lot for wisdom. But it's not going to just be beat this guy over the head with evidences. It's not going to just be laugh at his Holocaust jokes, show him that you're one of the guys. It's not going to just be
Right. It's not
press,
any of those things.
press
Yeah.
into his heart. It might be a conglomeration of the things, because you need to like know the person and use Christian love and charity and wisdom to help you discern how to do it. Because, and this is I want you to take the mic, but essentially,
That split. Yeah. I agree with what you're saying.
I want you to give a word
Yeah.
to fathers, specifically fathers raising young men, but then also fathers that have daughters who are with young men. That I think a large majority of the young men in America, a larger majority than most people realize, are flirting with these things because of the internet and their access to it. And so, what advice would you
Yeah.
give to fathers?
Well, before I do I'll do the father thing in 1 second, but I want to say something about your precept versus classical for a second. And this is I find this phrase funny, but in a weird way it kind of works. And it's a little crass, but um, the idea of classical theology in the streets and precept in the sheets. Okay, so there's like this split between classical apologetics in public rough and tumble rhetoric and debate, online or in person or whatever, in those type of impersonal environments, and then in more intimate environments, the presuppositional perspective, trying to really understand what's going on in this person's soul, getting a feel for a lot more of the root level
Pressing them
beliefs
to
that are leading
repent.
to this, walking with somebody for years and years and years, and seeing how the application of like maybe their red pill manosphere ideology, how does that work out over a 5 or 10 year period in the relationships? Let's find out. Let's meet and have lunch every few weeks and talk about how that's working for you. And over time, maybe that will start to reveal some parts of your heart that aren't congruent with reality. Let's figure that out. But that works over time, and it's a lot more intimate and difficult. And or maybe not more difficult, I guess, depending on what you are temperamentally, but it just takes more time. When it comes to advice for fathers, I think this is kind of the thing that the quintessential um, critique of the boomer father is like a lack of interest in their kids
Mm,
or desire to be engaged with them on a level that requires that much expended effort.
mm,
And I think that being willing to be like, hey, it took you 200 hours on the internet to come to all these conclusions, which is not unrealistic for a lot of these guys in terms of how much time they've focused on these things, even if they're teenagers. It took you 200 hours to get to these conclusions. I'm older than you. I'm going to spend 400 trying to unpack it
mm.
and also figure out the things that are wrong with it. And I know you really well personally, and then I'm going to be able to put that in a format that you're going to understand. And even if in the moment you don't agree with me, you'll know that I understand you and the culture that you're in better than some guy that doesn't really care about you and just wants to condemn you.
And
And
without
I think
giving in to their victimhoodness or whatever, their
right.
the victim Olympics with them, um, is there something to be said about, you know, y you have to acknowledge the where they're coming from. Like, what would make an ideology like this attractive to them? Do you think that there's any validity to trying to help, like, understanding their culture and where they're at and being able to say, I see why something like this might feel attractive to you."
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think some of that is going to be implicit if you're able to steelman
For
what they
sure.
believe.
Yeah.
Because what they'll do, because if you just say to somebody, um, I understand how you could be attracted to these beliefs. That's one thing. But then if you say, here is my best representation of what you believe and why you believe it, and you can get them to agree with you as if you're on their side when you explain what you think they believe, that's going to be a lot more effective, I think, than just saying, I can see how this is attractive to you.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree. Just doing the
Um,
work of and I think I interrupted you. Please
no,
keep
I don't
going,
think I
please.
don't think you did. I think we're good, but
Um, and I think a lot of that applies to pastors too, I believe, because this is gonna come across their desk, in the counseling office as well.
I had a guy in my church whose son is getting into a lot of this stuff, and we had him over for dinner like 3 or 4 weeks ago,
Does
and
he know who you are?
yeah, he does. Yeah, he does. That's actually how people at my church who know who I am online and stuff.
Your
He
name is hilarious because it's like, this is our guy.
Oh yeah, believe me. Yeah, try to be like on Twitter in public or whatever, and you've got like Hitler avatars
Ye
all over your phone. That's a fun time. But anyway, yeah, uh I had this guy over and just talking to him, and I mean I think we spent the entire time basically just me explaining to him um why his son believes this. That's like really the only thing I did was like, this is why your son believes this.
Mm,
Because he just had no idea. He had kind of a semblance of an idea, but to him, this just was totally out of left field. And the fact is like these kids have spent hundreds of hours like interested and hyper fixated on these topics. And so you have to be equipped to deal with it. Like,
mhm,
and we understand this, like back to the apologetics example. If your kid is like reading Bart Ehrman and is like telling you that he doesn't believe that Christ claimed to be God and that he thought that Paul perverted Christianity. Like say your son hits you with that, and you're
yeah.
like, I don't even know who Bart Ehrman is. You got some reading to do, dude.
Yeah.
And if you're not willing to do that, then you're kind of cooked.
Mm,
Not to say that God can't work in the heart of your kid because he can, but really there's a level of legwork that as a parent, I think that is your responsibility to take on
yeah,
to to really be a caretaker of your kid's soul, you
yeah.
know?
Yeah, and I hope that this is helpful for people because I feel like we were one of the issues that I have with these conversations is because it's so emotional and heated. Um, like there's only one angle that even a 2-hour podcast just kind of hits one drum, and I like how you've been able to give such a broad overview and then be able to duck in and out of different angles to the conversation as well, and talk about the ideology and then the historical facts and then the modern issues and then to be able to bring it to application like this. I hope that this can be not the only one, but a one-stop shop for people. Um, and I'm thinking about fathers and pastors. And on that note too about you got to do the work. Um, this is part of our call as fathers, husbands, and leaders is to do the work. And we don't expect them to know every meme, but to be and speaking of, this person that's reached out to me, he has done some work, since the last few weeks since this came across his desk, and he's a good man because of that. And that's what a good man should do is say, okay, well, if this is the new thing to think through, then
Right.
it's time for me to offer some wisdom. And so I hope this can be a tool for that. And is there anything that we haven't covered that you could at least just say, "Hey, we didn't really touch on this, and I think that this is something you should go Google and look up." Um, any other thoughts that you have before we close out?
No, nothing in the way of topics, but one thing I do want to point out that I think is a hopeful idea um, is maybe because you're in the media space, you kind of get this a little bit more, but it's my understanding that um, oftentimes the church is late to the party on things like new avenues of media, right? I feel like we only figured out how to make like really good Christian movies in some ways in the last like 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
And movies have been around a
Um,
long time.
Terrence Malick is the only exception to that, or one of the only
Okay.
few. Do you know who Terrence
Okay.
Malick is?
I know the name.
Hey, and I'll recommend this to you and listeners. Everybody should go watch A Hidden Life, and it's about the Nazis, but he is one of those quietly Christian and just a quiet
Oh,
person.
he made Thin Red Line. Yeah, that movie
Mhm.
slaps. Okay, just Google him.
Yeah,
Very cool. Okay.
he's a Christian. He's a Christian filmmaker, and, anyway, I just wanted to
Sweet.
recommend that. Go check that movie out, but it is
Yeah.
extremely rare, and it's sad that
Mm.
Stanley Kubrick is one of the greats, and he's not exactly your Christian ideal, but we need more anyway. I'm movies
Yeah.
is like a I love filmmaking, so I had
Yeah. Well, so what I was going to relate that to is that I think that the church takes longer to figure out where it fits in cultural zeitgeists as they develop. And like Christians basically took over radio, but it took us a couple decades to
yeah.
figure out how to do radio. And when we did, we just won. And I feel like we're almost in the early stages of some of that regarding
Here's some
filmmaking.
post-millennialism in you.
Well, yeah, a little bit, man. I'm pretty hopeful. And
Yeah.
listen, the same goes for ideological things, right?
Yeah.
The world and Satan. There's a million possible lies that he can create
Yeah.
and get somebody to believe, and there's a million possible routes to get people to believe these lies, and there's one truth, and it takes time and much longer time to create truthful responses to those things than it does to create the lies.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the reasons why a lot of this really dissident right, hyper racial identitarian stuff has been so jarring to people is that it feels like it kind of came out of left field and
Yeah.
nobody was prepared for it. And I think it's similar to what happened with a lot of the woke stuff 10, 15 years ago. It's the same thing. And in the same way that I think a lot of the woke stuff to some extent has lost cultural power, and Christians in a lot of ways I'm very proud have spoken out against that in a proper way and countered it. I think the same thing will happen here, and it's just going to take time. But it'd be faster if people put in the work.
Yeah. We will see. And I suspect this is not the last time that our paths shall cross, brother.
Okay.
And if we were in
Sounds good.
person, I would give you a bro handshake and hug.
There you
I
go.
appreciate you, man. Thanks for coming
Pat,
on.
we get past the peace.
Yes, sir. All right, man. Well, you take care.
Thanks.
All right.